Alright, we are back with a new video, and this is part 3 of a series where I am ranking every single episode of MLP Friendship is Magic. Now, in part 1, I did the top 10 worst episodes of the series, so you can check that one out. And in part 2, we basically did a lot of the bottom half, going from number 11 on the worst episode list all the way down to 101. So essentially, from here on out in this series, we are inside the top 100 going through the top 100 best episodes in Friendship is Magic. But before we get started, let's just briefly recap the format of this series. So again, this is part of a 4-part series. And in this part, we're essentially starting from 100 and going all the way down to number 11. Now, I'll be stopping there because I intend for part 4 to be the top 10 best of the episodes of the series, with this video essentially being more of the rest. I'm essentially doing it this way so that we can still do a big ranking like this, rank every single episode, while still appealing to the crowd of people who only want like a top 10 best episode or a top 10 worst episode, and also just to give more gravitas to those exceptional cases here. Well, this part is more so a way of me talking about episodes that didn't quite make the best episode of the series, but still ones that I want to talk about nonetheless. And obviously, as we go along, we're going to get into some pretty good episodes that I'm probably going to dedicate more time to talking about than honestly a lot of the episodes from part 2, where I felt like in part 2 I was kind of blowing through a lot of the mediocre episodes that were mostly forgettable and ones that I didn't really have much to say about. So hopefully here I'll definitely have some episodes that I'll get to talk more about, and I'm sure along with that will come plenty of controversy. I know some people may not agree with all my takes here, but again, this ranking is largely my own opinion. And eventually, we're going to get into the honorable mentions for the best episodes of the series, only to cut it off right before the start of the list. So hopefully, this should make for a long but hopefully enjoyable list. But with that said, there are 90 episodes to talk about in this video, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So picking up right where we left off at number 100 is an episode that I do like for the most part. However, it does have one pretty big glaring hole in its plot that makes it kind of redundant. But here from season 9, we have The Point of No Return. In many ways, I do like this episode a lot. It's kind of a spiritual successor to Amending Fences, where it is trying to build this whole story off something that happened really fast in the first couple minutes of the series, which is a pretty interesting prospect. And the fact that they even attempted to do this again is somewhat interesting, although I feel like the actual premise here is a lot flimsier than that of Amending Fences, where a lot of it hinges on Twilight like being someone who checks out so many books that she doesn't even read all of them, and which is fine. I mean, it's sort of funny in some ways, but the fact that she doesn't even bother to read the cover of the book that she forgot to check out, despite having it in eyesight the entire episode, is pretty dumb and probably could have resolved this entire conflict. Like, if she had taken, like, literally not even a second to read the cover, like, about how perfection is impossible, then she probably should have at least looked in a mirror and probably come to her senses a bit. Heck, even Spike could have read the cover and just let her know that she was overreacting to a degree, but she doesn't. And through that, we get this entire story of Twilight like panicking over not like checking the book, how she has ruined her like perfect record at the library, and how she may have even caused Dusty Pages to get fired, only for Dusty Pages to be inspired by this to realize that perfection is impossible, and she ends up retiring, quitting her job, and moving to this retirement facility where she's just living her best life. And like, I mean, that's all fine and all, but the fact that this all stems from a library book, and one in which you literally just read the cover and just quickly realize like just how this all could have been avoided, is pretty silly. But if we're taking that out, I still do enjoy this episode. I do like how Twilight is trying to come up with all these stories about how she was at fault and how this all ties back into her, like when really it really wasn't, but whatever. Also, Moondancer briefly appears in this episode, which I do appreciate to such a degree. And I do like how Dusty Pages really has moved on, and I like how Twilight always has a picture of her only for it to get ruined because she's just taking it out all the time. is at least somewhat entertaining for me. So this is a good episode, and I kind of view it similarly to Party Pooch, where it is a good episode and has plenty of good moments in it. And I also like how it sort of captures the tone and spirit of Amending Fences in a lot of ways. However, it does have one glaring plot hole that kind of causes some of the story to fall apart. And even outside that, the fact that they even tried to make this episode, while I do appreciate the ambition, still falls a bit short for me, and it's for that reason that I do have it here at number 100. Now moving on to number 99, and from this point on, every episode should probably get a medal, as they are now part of the double digit club. We're no longer in the triple digits, so take that as you will. But at number 99, we have a pretty good episode, definitely an enjoyable episode, but one that is a bit cliche at the end of the day. But here we have Horseplay, and this episode is your very typical honesty is the best policy story. And it's really silly how Twilight spends so much of the episode trying to lie to Celestia about how she's a good actress when she's really terrible. And it's very obvious. It's very obvious what the message is. And the fact that we're literally playing the song and dance in season 8 is probably not ideal. Even Applejack had multiple opportunities to where she could speak up, but the fact that Twilight never listens is not great. And that's really what's holding this episode back to a degree. But at the end of the day, the main reason that I like it is just how funny and entertaining it is. We obviously have all of the scenes of Celestia being really bad at acting, like with her trying to say the line, "It is time for a new day in Equestria." You have her trying to dance but screwing up. She has her breaking the sets. She can't even play a game of charades. Like, it's just a big mess, and Celestia probably recognizes deep down that she's not a good actress, but she is honing her craft. We have the scene where Twilight finally explodes, and I do like the scene how it just builds up to her losing her temper, and she calls Celestia the worst actress in Equestria, and obviously that was the cue for Celestia to overhear that, and the whole scene breaks out with like Celestia getting mad at her and like flying off. So this episode is pretty entertaining because of Celestia, and it does have plenty of funny moments in the middle. And it also has Fluttershy like really building on her character development with her being in the play first as the narrator, but by the end, like taking on the lead role as Celestia, which I do like, and how she has built up her confidence to the point where she is like performing in front of everyone. So I do like that aspect to it, and on the whole, this is an entertaining episode. It's just the fact that the actual story itself is very cliche, very baseline. The message is super basic, that I can't have it any higher than this. But the entertainment value alone makes it here at number 99. Now we're moving on to number 98, and we definitely have a controversial episode here. And sort of similar to some other episodes that I talked about in part 2, I'm sure some people feel like that episode probably belongs down there. However, I don't feel like the episode handles its message as actively bad as certain other episodes, and I do still enjoy it quite a bit. And I do at least appreciate the ambition that this episode had, even if it didn't quite do it as well as it could have. But in 98, we do have Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep? And I know plenty of people hate this episode, and I understand why people hate this episode, but I don't. And I do appreciate the ambition that this episode had, where it tried to basically make Luna this more interesting character by her talking about how she's had all this self loathing all this time from when she was like Nightmare Moon, and how she has resorted to punishing herself so that she never makes the same mistake again. And I get the issues with them trying to go for a message like this. I mean, it does come out of nowhere. I really wish that there was more foreshadowing to it in previous episodes. And even as it is, they don't really shine a light as much on the fact that this whole scheme to punish yourself could just as easily result in like more trouble happening, particularly if the Tantabus got out, which it obviously does in this episode. So that's not great. But if we're taking that out, I do like how a lot of this episode is taking place in people's dreams. I do like how we get to see inside people's dreams for a lot of it. And I do like the idea that Luna hasn't fully accepted like herself in the post-redemption phase of her life. And I do at least appreciate what they were trying to go for here. And yes, while I don't feel like they do it super well, I also feel like they don't do it as actively bad as something like A Rock Hoof and A Hard Place, where I really feel like that episode definitely had some tonal issues. I at least give this episode some credit for remaining somewhat on point. I do at least see where they were coming from with them trying to do this more serious message. And if even if we're taking that out, there's still plenty of good stuff in there, like seeing people in their dreams, how they're using the fact that they're in a dream in order to try to resolve the conflict. And we see stuff like Big Mac, like turning himself into a super princess, which obviously has some foreshadowing there. We have Scootaloo growing these enormous wings that obviously has plenty of subtext there. And there's some funny imagery as well, like the fact that Lyra and Bonbon are like fused together, kind of like cat dog. Like there's some funny moments there as well. So it's not as if this episode doesn't have anything going for it. And I do like this episode more than certain other people. Now, I know there are people who also obviously love this episode. They feel like it really nails it pretty well. And while I'm not in that group either, like I still recognize the flaws that this episode has, both for what I was trying to go for and the way it executed it. I don't feel like I can fully discredit it either. So through that, I feel like it kind of lands here in the middle of the list. And with me getting some entertainment value out of it, I did decide to give it the edge and putting it a bit higher than some people may put it otherwise. But at the end of the day, I still recognize the issues with the episode. It's for that reason that it is here at number 98. Now we're moving on to number 97, and we're jumping a bit forward now to season 7, to an episode that I think is good and somewhat relatable, but also one that has some issues. But here we have Forever Philly. And as I talked about before in previous videos, the main issue I have with this episode is that it does go a bit too far with Sweetie Belle not really buying into Rarity's efforts to bond with her. And I feel like Sweetie Belle gets a bit insensitive as well, despite the fact that I do relate to her quite a bit. And that's part of the reason why I do like this episode, is that we basically see Rarity infantilizing Sweetie Belle for a lot of it, with her not fully accepting the fact that Sweetie Belle is a bit older now and is into different things than she was before. And in turn, a lot of the episode is about both Rarity accepting that, but also Sweetie Belle like going around a bit more, with her being less of a snob and her kind of just seeing Rarity for what she is, which is kind of a part of growing up, where you have that phase like when you get a bit older, when you feel like you're too good for everything and you are a bit like snobbish when it comes to your newfound quote unquote cultivated interests. And it's about like learning to see others for who they are, and about seeing where people are coming from, that causes you to sort of like grow up a little bit. So in that regard, I do kind of relate to Sweetie Belle, but still, I do feel like Sweetie Belle can get a bit insensitive here and a bit unlikable at points. But even so, I still do relate to Sweetie Belle and just this general story about like Sweetie Belle growing up and like the older sibling having to come to terms with that. And that is part of the reason why I do have this episode inside the top half, but it does have enough issues going with it. And plus, it's not the most interesting thing in the world either. That does leave it here at number 97. Now we're moving on to number 96, and we have another season 7 episode to get into here. But here we have Fluttershy Leans In. And admittedly, I was a bit too high on this episode in my season 7 video, where I do like the episode, and I do like the way that it treats Fluttershy and how she basically is already assertive. The fact that she never fully caves in and always has this vision from the beginning of what she wants is something that I do admire about the episode. But realistically, despite its relatively high placement on the season 7 ranking, I still find it to be a middle of the road episode in the grand scheme of things, where we obviously see each of the experts coming in and trying to tell Fluttershy how it is, only for Fluttershy to double down on like her vision of things and not really accepting that. Really, this episode isn't the most spectacular in the world. It's not the most entertaining, if I'm being honest, which is why I did drop it a little bit, but I still give this episode quite a bit of credit, and I do like the overall story that goes forward, even if it doesn't technically end with Fluttershy learning anything, and that is part of the reason that I have it here on number 96. Now we're moving on to number 95, and this is an episode I am a bit conflicted upon. There are definitely some good moments from this episode, and certainly some funny moments here, but this episode is just kind of mean-spirited, which does definitely damper my enjoyment of it to a degree, but it's still a fine enough episode. But here we have The Mean Six, and there are some positives to this episode. I do like how we see like this whole story going on with the mean Twilight trying to overthrow Chrysalis and her trying to get the rest of the mean counterparts together to try to take control of this whole plan, which does lead into Chrysalis basically killing each of the mean six by the end of it. And that scene by itself is somewhat interesting. We obviously see throughout the episode each of the mean counterparts basically just sowing distrust between the actual main six throughout a lot of it. And that's somewhat interesting, although the fact that the main six never fully catch on to it is a bit weird, if you ask me. And obviously, the main fault with the episode is that the main six, like, just come out of this episode, like, not in the most optimistic light. They do kind of take this more pessimistic approach at the end of it, with them, even Pinky saying, "This is the worst trip ever," like saying that like it's a good thing, which is kind of strange. And again, the fact that they never fully pick up on it, despite some pretty nasty stuff happening, like when mean Applejack tells Starlight that she just made her put all that stuff on just to make her look ridiculous, and then Starlight getting pretty offended by that. You also have like later on when Pinky like is trying to talk Twilight's ear off about all the adventures they went on. I do like the callbacks there, but then that leads into like Twilight and Pinky running into the real Fluttershy after she gets emotional, and then Pinky tries to make her feel better, but then mean Twilight is like, tell her to get over it, and then Pinky gets upset, but then mean Twilight rocks away right in time for the real Twilight to come in, and then Pinky gets upset, she gets into an argument with Twilight, and then Twilight gets offended by saying, "Wow, if my friends felt this way about my camping trip, maybe they should have just stayed home." And then Fluttershy is like, "Can't we just all get along?" So really this episode is just a lot of arguing and not too much like productive stuff happening. And the fact that even by the end they never fully learn about it is kind of strange. And obviously with Chrysalis like failing in this scheme, like, and kills off the mean six, it makes the episode kind of filler, if you ask me, where it did seem like coming into it that it could have contributed to this plot development moving forward. And yeah, well, I could say that it is sort of foreshadowing for Chrysalis eventually like becoming more relevant in season 9. And for this episode at least, like it just feels kind of like pointless, where this scene never comes up again, and Chrysalis just teams up with the evil trio, and that's just kind of it. And really, that's pretty much this episode, where it's a bunch of arguing. I mean, bunch of like not fun stuff happening, and then by the end of it, nothing is really advanced. But there are enough funny moments here, and there's enough intrigue going on, particularly with mean Twilight, to where I can at this episode lower than this. But in general, it's not my favorite episode, and it is here at number 95. Now moving on to number 94, and this is an episode that I would think I would enjoy better given its subject matter, but really as it is, it's just kind of fine. But here we have Stranger Than Fanfiction from season 6, aka the introduction of Quibble Pants. And I do like this episode, and it is sort of a change of pace to a degree, where similar to Slice of Life and some other episodes we'll be getting to soon, this is definitely an episode that focuses more on the fandom side of things, that is an episode that truly acknowledges how much the show itself has been influenced by its adult fan base. And I would say it's definitely better than someone like Fame and Misfortune, which is mostly mean-spirited. You know, like, and we do get some pretty good stuff between Rainbow Dash and Quibble Pants, the fact that they're getting into these dumb arguments over what characters they like and stuff like that. And we get plenty of quote-unquote self-aware humor from Quibble Pants throughout a lot of it, where he thinks the whole like adventure that they go on is part of this experience that's part of the con that they're at. So there's that. And just Quibble Pants in general is an interesting enough character, you know, like voiced by Patton Oswalt, which I find pretty humorous. But as it is, I mean, I feel like the episode still is a bit self-aware at points and definitely gets in its own way at certain points. So I can't have this episode too high because of that. But I will acknowledge that it is better than something like Fame and Misfortune, which delves almost entirely into the negative side of fandom. Whereas this episode is a bit more like reasonable, in my opinion, but still an episode that is largely dependent on that to a degree, and just having that outside subtext to make it more enjoyable. And it's for that reason that I do have it here at number 94. Now we're moving on to number 93, and this is an episode that, again, kind of fits well with this tier, where it is a good episode, but certainly one that has some stupid stuff in it that keeps it down a bit lower. But here we have It Isn't the Main Thing About You from season 7. And yeah, this episode does have some stupid stuff in it, like the whole logic behind how growth works in terms of magic, where apparently hair has to come from somewhere for some reason, even though we literally saw in other episodes like Ghostbusters where Twilight was just able to give Spike a mustache and there was never any issues with that. But for whatever reason, in this episode, they had to give an excuse for why they couldn't just regenerate Rarity's mane. So they had to come up with this excuse about how they have to take hair from somewhere, which is just really weird, especially since we never have any other rule established for anything else. I mean, I guess you could say that it's because it's organic matter, but even then, like you have stuff like apples and fruits being able to be generated without any negative consequences there. So it's just really dumb that they had that sort of rule. Plus, it was very obvious from very early on that this mix up was bound to happen, particularly when Pinky got a very similar style bottle for cleaning up the mess, while Rarity got hers specifically for her mane. And obviously, they got mixed up to where by the end of it, we see Pinky coming out with this really flowing mane that was meant for Rarity. And also the fact that Pinky herself never shows up in the episode, despite her being pretty central to the conflict. And part of the reason why Rarity is in this predicament to begin with, the fact that she just disappears for several days while she's just in this massive bubble bath, and no one ever stops to wonder, hey, you got a bottle from Pinky as well. Why don't we go check up on her? Which I guess is sort of stupid in my opinion. So there's definitely some stupid stuff in this episode, both in terms of preventing the conflict, but also just why it was this ignored for so much of the episode. But aside from that, the episode itself is fine. I mean, especially for someone like Rarity, like for her to like learn this message about like accepting herself and her like worrying that like her having a bad appearance will cause her to like lose her popularity, only for it to turn out that it was because of her confidence and her charisma that caused people to be drawn to her, and her by the end of it just taking on a new look and just embracing her new appearance is pretty good. And we do flash forward a bit where she has her new mane, and I do like that little moment where she's a bit nervous about it on the day where the magazine came out that she was supposed to appear in, only for it to turn out that she was in the magazine the whole time on the day when she was showing off her new appearance, which is pretty nice. I do like that ending. So this episode definitely is pretty good on the whole and definitely has some good parts to it. But there's enough stupidity going on, enough dumb stuff that I can't have it too much higher than 93 here. Now we're moving on to number 92, and we have an interesting episode, although one that I felt like could have been better. But here we have Equestria Games. And considering the fact that the whole Equestria Games was a season-long story arc, really extending more than a season going back to season 3, the fact that this is the culmination of it is a little underwhelming. The fact that so much of it focuses on Spike and him just really dropping the ball on his reputation and him just trying to get used to his popularity in the Crystal Empire for saving it, but then just completely like screwing up the anthem when he thought it was the Ponyville anthem, and then obviously him just failing to light the fire at the start of the games, and then just him feeling like he's a failure and that he screwed everything up, only to end up saving the Crystal Empire again and becoming even more of a celebrity by the end of it. So the fact that it was so centric on Spike, while the actual games is kind of a sideshow, like we see like Rainbow Dash, like and all that stuff from her back in Rainbow Falls doesn't really amount to much. We see the CMC and the fact that they were the flag bearers for Ponyville going back to Flight to the Finish. That doesn't really have much of a payoff in this episode. Like all these things like that we saw from the like Equestria Games being set up in earlier episodes doesn't really amount to much in this particular episode. Now, something I did talk about before is what if this was just part of the season finale, where this is part of a two-parter where the Equestria Games is sort of a backdrop for the like Tyrek or whatever like villain that they were going to throw in to end season 4. And yes, while I do love Twilight's Kingdom, I felt like that could have been a better resolution to season 4 than anything else. The fact that you have the games happening as this backdrop, and it's only at the start of the games when like the villain comes in and trashes everything, and then maybe at the end after you defeat the villain that we could go back to the games and maybe like have it have a new purpose or something. Like people are now glad that they came together and defeated this villain, and now they get to celebrate each other through the games, and through that they become less competitive, and that it becomes more about friendship and just good old competition and fun. Like, there are definitely ways in which they could have incorporated it better, but even so, this episode's just kind of fine. I mean, while it's not my favorite episode per se, there are still some good moments within it, and it's because of that that I have at least as high at number 92. Now we're moving on to number 91, and we are finally at our first two-parter on this list. And here we have Shadow Play. Now, just as a reminder, I am counting two-parters as one episode on this list. So through that, we are counting both parts 1 and 2 of Shadow Play on this entry. And this is kind of a good spot for it, where despite me saying that this is the worst two-parter across all my previous videos, I still think it's a good episode in the grand scheme of things. You know, like with it having a lot of the gravitas that comes with it being a two-parter, and there's still plenty of good stuff within it. I mean, you have Starlight trying to like really stand up for Stygian here by saying that maybe this is a friendship problem, and how the cutie map summoned them because maybe it could be a friendship problem, much like how the main six are drawn to her village because that was a friendship problem back then, only for the pillars to completely reject this, and for Star Scroll to even note that once a villain, always a villain. And then Starlight keeps trying to like stick up for Stygian, all while keep trying to vouch for her own cause, given that she was a former villain and that she was given a second chance as well. But then not only did the pillars reject this, but Twilight herself doesn't stick up for her in that instance. And that leads to that moment where Starlight says that it's a good thing, like your idol didn't meet me when you became my friend. I might have been banished to limbo too, which is a pretty touching moment there. And outside of that, there's some interesting stuff like you have during part 2, you have the pillars like being shown modern civilization. So that's something, I guess. But really, this episode is probably the least remarkable of the two-parters. I mean, Stygian himself isn't a very interesting antagonist throughout a lot of it. His whole story is pretty cookie cutter based on what we saw before. And a lot of part 1 is also pretty bland, where I feel like part 2 is definitely more interesting than part 1. But even then, like, this two-parter is definitely no better than like a better than average episode of the overall series. And I feel like other two-parters like have elements of this one that are better than what we have here in Shadow Play. So through that, I can't say Shadow Play is a particularly great two-parter. I still think it's the weakest one, but in the grand scheme of things, I still get some stuff out of it, and it's still good enough to be here at number 91. Now we're moving on to number 90, and I definitely consider putting this episode a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, it's not that exceptional in the grand scheme of things, though there are a couple interesting moments within it. But here we have the times they are a changeling, and there are a few things from this small episode that are interesting, like obviously the fact that Spike is a big celebrity in the Crystal Empire, and they make such a big deal about how towards the end he sacrifices a lot of that in order to stand up for Thorax here, and then obviously that leads to everyone else accepting Thorax for who he is, so there's that. There's also Thorax's behavior while he's disguised as his pony, and through that, we get some interesting moments there, like the fact that he is wanting to change and wanting to not feed off people's love, but he is still genetically predisposed to do so, which does lead to that moment where he is brought into the throne room, where he is seeing Flurryheart, and he is just so overwhelmed that his biological instincts kick in, and he turns back into a changeling and gets exposed that way. And yes, while it's not great, it's sort of a similar issue to Secret of My Excess, with like changelings being genetically predisposed towards feeding off love, and obviously Thorax is probably incapable of doing so without starving to death, and it's only after season 6 that the changelings literally change so that they can feed off like not love and not just be parasites. But it's still an interesting moment in that like Thorax is wanting to change, but is just prone to his natural instincts that prevent him from doing so, and obviously being caught. And then there's a song which is not the greatest song in the world. I know plenty of people prop it up, but it's really just fine. And then through that, we get to the whole ending with obviously the ponies accepting Thorax and realizing that they shouldn't be so racist. But at the end of the day, I feel like other episodes are more impressive to me than this one. And because of that, I do have it here at number 90. Now we're moving on to number 89, and we have an episode somewhat similar to the Times They Are Changeling, where despite it not being as relevant to the overall series as that episode, it's still one that definitely gives off similar vibes to me. But here we have Winter Wrap Up, and this is a good episode. Not one that I would say is the best, but still has some plenty of good moments within it. You have Twilight really wanting to prove herself and her really wanting to be useful in cleaning up Winter, but just keeps screwing up at every opportunity, all while people are getting mad at her due to her screwing up. And then later, when she tries using magic, it makes everything worse, which isn't great. The song is definitely a highlight to the episode and really one that really makes the series stand out, as it was really one of the first instances in the series of the show having this pretty good song that got people hooked. So at least there's that. Now it does have a similar issue to Thanks for the Memories in that it makes you wonder why winter even exists in the first place and why people even bother to have winter if it's such a hassle to clean up by the end of it. But the episode does justify it a bit more by at least highlighting the inefficiencies of Ponyville trying to clean up winter the old-fashioned way, and also pointing out that other places like Canterlot have a more systematic way of cleaning up winter at the end of it. So at least there's that. And at least by the end of the episode, we do have the message of Twilight being the main organizer behind it all and the importance of organization. Although even then it's kind of undercut when they allow Spike to sleep in the frozen pond, and obviously when the ice melts, he ends up getting sick because of it. So that's not probably the best, but it's still a good enough episode to have it this high on the list. But again, we're starting to get to the point on the list where I feel like a lot of it's going to be dictated by how much value the episode has, both from an entertainment standpoint, but also from a characterization and message and just storytelling perspective. And this episode is good, but I feel like episodes we'll be talking about soon have more to offer. And because of that, it is here at number 89. And continuing with that idea, we move on to number 88, where we have the pilot of the series. And here we have Friendship is Magic. Now, this episode is pretty good at setting up the characters, introducing us to the world, and just doing stuff to set up the series. Now, obviously, there's some weird stuff involved, like the fact that Applejack doesn't just explain why, she is so confident in Twilight letting go of the cliff. She could have just said that Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash were ready to catch her, so there's that. And just in general, it definitely has some slow-paced issues at points. It's definitely a slower episode, one that's very susceptible to season 1 awkwardness. And as obviously this was the first episode of the series, so it had plenty of stuff that was just trying out but just never stuck with again, like Spike having trouble pronouncing stuff and him just being bad at spelling, which is never brought up again moving forward. Now, the character introductions themselves are pretty good. You have Fluttershy being pretty nervous around ponies, but the minute she's exposed to an animal, she's just immediately perking up and immediately being confident. You have Rainbow Dash establishing her love for the Wonderbolts and how that's her main goal moving forward. You have Applejack introducing us to all our family members, and the fact that we don't really see them again till the Apple family reunion the next time that rolls around is a bit humorous there. And outside of that, there's some pretty good moments as well. You have right at the beginning, you have Twilight being invited to Moondancer's party, but then just rejecting it and not really realizing what that set off. We also have the whole resolution where they defeat Nightmare Moon, and it's so revealed that Celestia and Luna are sisters. Though realistically, they probably should have put those pieces together, but whatever. You have Celestia, obviously, knowing about the threat, but choosing to send Twilight to Ponyville anyway, not really explaining why, this is all relevant, when it easily could have backfired, so there's that. And really, it's just a fine episode, all things considered. It definitely benefits from, being the first entry in the series, but is also harmed by that in the sense that it obviously doesn't have much to work off of since it's spending so much of the time introducing us to everything. So on the whole, it's still a pretty good episode, and definitely one that was good enough to keep people coming back to where we could have the rest of the series. But as it is, in comparison to everything that came afterward, I can't really have it higher than 88 here. Now we're moving on to number 87, and we actually have another episode very similar to Friendship is Magic, and it's actually another two-parter, but here we have School Days. In School Days, in a lot of ways, feels like Friendship is Magic again, only this time we don't even have much of an antagonist. A lot of it is seen as introducing us to the school and introducing us to the Creature 6 and really just making it feel like a new era for the series, like that we are trying to pivot in this different direction. And yes, while the show doesn't dedicate more of its time towards the Creature Six moving forward, it still has that vibe of it being a pilot and us being introduced to this very new context that would define the rest of the series moving forward. And we do see the Creature Six getting a lot of screen time here, with them bonding, with them getting over their differences, and obviously, like, still getting into arguments along the way until they learn that they can work together. And along the way, we have like Twilight trying to get EEA approval and her sticking to the book, which obviously gets a lot of people like not as invested into the school moving forward. We have them trying to do this open house, but then because the Creature Six skipped class and ran off and attracted a monster that caused the orientation to get messed up, and for Naysay to really shut down the school, that leads into sort of part two, where Twilight does a lot of wallowing and how there is no bright side and just being a big mope. And it takes Starlight showing her some tough love and really her demonstrating why she was a guidance counselor that caused her to get out of it, and for her to get the Creature Six back together and to reopen the school. Now, the one knock I would give this episode is that we do see at the end that Celestia is completely willing to sidestep the EEA regulations just to prove a point about friendship being a completely different type of education model than any other school, and therefore it doesn't need to follow the regulations, which was just a really dumb way of sidestepping the rules. Like, why would you establish at the beginning of the two-parter that even princesses need to follow the law, and even princesses need to follow these regulations, but then by the end of it, like, you get around the issue by just completely ignoring the law, and how, like, Twilight just has this type of school that would be exempt from this law, and how it's Celestia herself who's declaring that this exception is in place and how they don't need to follow the regulations and stuff. So I did find that pretty dumb. But at the end of the day, I did find this to be a fine enough episode. Not really enough to elevate it beyond this point, as despite being a two-parter, it doesn't really do much to make it feel like a two-parter like this. A lot of this could have been done in a regular 22-minute episode, but as it is, it's good enough to be here at number 87. Now we're moving on to number 86, and we have another season 8 episode to get into here, and I know some people feel like this episode is a bit too high on this list, and this episode certainly has some issues with it, and definitely some missed opportunities, but I still find it to be a solid episode that does introduce plenty of interesting ideas to it. But here we have the washouts. And the thing about the washouts is it definitely had a top tier story, in my opinion. And had it executed upon it better, I feel like it could have been significantly higher on the list. But as it is, like, it is good, but it still has some issues. I think the biggest of which is the ending, where we see Lightning Dust be very quickly sent off without much gravitas, and we don't really get a very satisfying conclusion to Scootaloo's concerns, where something that was brought up is that we did see in May the Best Pet Win that despite Tank being unable to fly, Rainbow Dash was very quickly and easily able to get around that by coming up with this flying contraption that would allow Tank to fly. However, here we don't really get that for Scootaloo. Like, it does sort of raise the question of why Scootaloo couldn't have something like that. Now, granted, that was something that could have been presented to us in any previous episode, but obviously this one makes all her disability front and center, and it makes it such a big deal that Scootaloo herself has accepted the fact that she can never fly and that she'll never be good enough to, in Rainbow Dash's eyes, to be accepted, because she'll never be able to be a Wonderbolt, and that she treats the washouts as this outlet to get around her disability. Sort of like how Lightning does in the other rejects, like use the washouts to, like, sort of buck the establishment and to, like, still have an outlet for their performance tendencies, even though, like, they weren't in the Wonderbolts anymore for whatever reason. So I felt like they could have done a bit more to address that, and the whole Scootaloo addressing that she has a disability and that she isn't able to fly, I wish we gotten more time to really establish that. Like, and yes, while we do see Rainbow Dash form her own Scootaloo Appreciation Club, like, I felt like they could have done a bit more than that. So take that as you will. But still, the very fact that they would go there, the very fact that we would have the storyline of Scootaloo, like, just not being very interested in the Wonderbolts at that point, and her turning to the washouts as a very viable, albeit dangerous, alternative to her inability to fly and her inability to actually be accepted into the Wonderbolt, is a very interesting concept, and we see Rainbow spending so much of the episode not really listening to Scootaloo and really trying to get her out of it, like sending her to Spitfire, who tells her that she'll end up in a full body wing and hoof cast if she dares join the washouts, which in itself is a hilarious scene. And we also get her like just trying to show the dangers of the washouts, but Scootaloo just being so desperate to have an outlet for this that she's willing to accept the risk regardless. And I feel like if the episode were written differently to give Scootaloo more of this focus on how she'll never be a Wonderbolt, I feel like this could have been a much better episode. And even as it is, there are still plenty of good moments. We still see Scootaloo's perpetual dissatisfaction with Rainbow Dash every time she talks about how awesome the Wonderbolts are and how she expects her to follow in her hoofsteps one day. And we see her like just being excited at joining the washouts, only to realize by the end that they don't really care about her safety. So even then, we still get plenty of entertainment, and plus, there's plenty of good comedy there. Like, again, the whole Spitfire scene is hilarious, but there are still enough issues with the episode that I can't have it any higher than this. But it is an episode that I do enjoy more than most people, and it's for that reason that it is here at number 86. Now we're moving on to number 85, and we actually have another two-parter to get into here. And I know that these couple of two-parters at the bottom of my two-parter ranking are kind of bunched together, but that's just how they are. But here we have the final two-parter, The Ending of the End. And I've already talked about this episode a couple times before, so I won't spend too much time talking about it here. But basically, it comes down to an episode that is good, but has plenty of glaring holes in it, namely the Grogar situation, which I've already talked about a number of times. It pretty much ruins Discord's redemption arc. And yes, while we do see Discord sort of redeem himself during the two-parter by helping them like break out of the prison, and even Rainbow Dash says, "Wow, now that's a comeback." Even so, I feel like the very concept of Grogar being a fake villain is pretty disappointing. And yes, while they don't really focus on Grogar too much, it really highlights just how much Discord really screwed up for seemingly no reason. And he doesn't really have much of a good reason to like test Twilight to this degree, especially considering how much she's already been tested throughout the series, so that's not particularly great. Twilight, in turn, has a pretty interesting arc here with her sort of losing her confidence as the evil trio take over Equestria, which culminates in her like escaping when she feels like she's let her friends down. And she really has that scene where she breaks down and feels like all is lost. And admittedly, while this is probably the two-parter where you would think this would make the most sense, it's still the fact that we've already seen them be at their lowest point a number of times before that really makes this a bit strange to me. Though it is nice seeing how the friends are able to make her feel better so that they can come around to solving the problem, so there's that. We also get the whole Wendigos, which did feel a bit extra, if I'm being honest. Like, I felt like it would have been a bit better if the Wendigos had just been metaphors for how, like, friendship is necessary for civilization to survive. And yes, while you could say that about the show in general, I mean, I still would have wished that the Wendigos had remained a like work of fiction and more of a metaphor in universe than anything else. You know, like, but even so, I do appreciate the whole side story about how like the evil trio are able to sow all this distrust by really tapping into this racism between the different races, which, considering what we end up seeing in G5, is pretty interesting as well. So it's not as if this is a bad two-parter by any means, and definitely has some high moments, but I feel like that's just it. It is a two-parter that is booned by a number of things, and with it being dragged down by other issues, namely the Grogar situation, I can't have it any higher than number 85 here. Now we're moving on to number 84, and we actually have the episode immediately preceding the ending of the end, but here we have the Big Mac question. And for me, this is a much better version of the breakup breakdown, where a lot of it focuses on this misunderstanding between like different parties, and with Big Mac trying to get engaged to Sweet Sugar Belle along the way. And there's just a lot of shenanigans that go on. Admittedly, not all of them are interesting if I'm being perfectly honest, but I feel like one of the main boons of this episode is the presentation, where we do see it in the perspective of the different characters giving these confessionals, where they basically give their side of the story almost as if this is like a documentary of sorts. So I do find that aspect pretty entertaining. And while we do have some shenanigans like Discord causing trouble for no reason, it's not as bad, and he's not as irritating as he is in other episodes, so I'm willing to give it a pass. Also, had to give a shout out to the scene moment where Lyra and Bonbon also get engaged, which I find pretty interesting. And obviously, that gets followed up upon in the last problem. And so the I guess reveal that they really were romantic this whole time is pretty interesting, even if it's a small little fan servicey moment, but I'll take it for what it is. This is just a fine episode that's definitely helped more so by its presentation than anything else, but it's not a bad one by any means, and that is a big reason I have it at least as high. But I feel like other episodes are more entertaining for me, which is a big reason I have it here at 84. Now we're moving on to number 83, and we have an episode that's kind of similar to the last two episodes we talked about, where it's not the best episode in the world, and it's not personally my favorite, but it is helped by its presentation to a great degree. But here we have a heartwarming tale, and I know plenty of people feel like this is one of their favorite episodes of the series, and for good reason. I mean, it is a musical episode, it is very much helped by that, and the songs for the most part are pretty good. I also like seeing some of the characters as these Christmas Carol characters just walking around playing the part. And in some ways, this episode is fun in the way that we get to see these characters putting on a performance, more so than it is an episode in its own right, which is something going for it. But at the end of the day, this is your typical Christmas Carol story. And even then, like, they can't even go all the way in some regards. Like, they can't have a Tiny Tim character, they can't show them actually dying. But then on the other hand, like, they actually make it sort of darker than the actual Christmas Carol story, where by Snowfall Frost, like, ending her Stormy Eve, she literally brings about the end of the world, which is pretty dark, but also pretty interesting as well. And it's also interesting how this all ties into the Wendigo stories, so you can see how this is a byproduct of other heartwarming stories, like the one that we saw in Heartwarming Eve back in season 2. And I guess that's enough to really make this episode worth it for me. It's a good episode, and it's good hearing the different songs, and it's good seeing these characters sort of putting on a performance. But at the end of the day, this is your typical Christmas Carol story, and even then, like, you have other things that aren't ideal with it, like the fact that Twilight is basically forcing Starlight to, like, enjoy the holiday as much as others, though you can justify that by saying that this is still during Starlight's redemption arc, and they really want to open up Starlight's mind, considering she's a student, and they don't want her to just be on her own, like, not really learning much about friendships. So there is a give or take involved there. But it's really the fact that this story isn't super original, and it's not even one that goes all the way in some regards, that makes it not the best episode for me. But there's enough going for it from a presentation standpoint and an entertainment standpoint that I have it here at 83. Now we're moving on to number 82, and these next two episodes are pretty similar in that they're both pretty large episodes in the grand scheme of the series, certainly more than A Heartwarming Tale. However, they have some pretty big issues that sort of keep them lower than what they probably would be if they were better constructed. And I know that these next two episodes are definitely controversial, and I'm sure some people feel like they both should be much lower on the list, but I still get enough entertainment from these two episodes that they are at least as high on the list. But at 82, we have the season 3 finale, Magical Mystery Cure. And obviously, this is a very important episode for the series. It's the episode where Twilight becomes an alicorn and, by extension, a princess. And it was obviously at one point supposed to be the series finale, with it feeling like that, particularly with the scene towards the end where Celestia is congratulating Twilight, and we get all those moments from earlier in the series that really made it feel like it was going to be the end and that this was somehow going to be the conclusion of everything. But then obviously the show got renewed for another season, and obviously we ended up getting 6 more seasons after that. But still, this is supposed to be an important episode for this series, and one that is obviously plagued by some issues. I think for me, the biggest issue is the whole premise here of the actual spell that causes all the cutie marks get mixed up. Like, the whole fact that, like, Twilight's cutie mark doesn't change while all the other ones change doesn't really make a ton of sense. It's also not super well explained, like, how the actual spell works, like whether it actually changes their memory, or like why the other ponies don't get involved. Like, when Pinkie is running the apple farm and Applejack just runs off, like, why doesn't Granny Smith or Appleloom or Big Mac jump in and try to stop her from doing stuff, which is a bit silly there. Also think this episode has some pacing issues, Like the fact that the actual conflict is resolved like 2/3 of the way through and we still have that entire third left isn't ideal, although I will personally accept it as sort of similar to Three's a Crowd. Objectively, the pacing is an issue, but from an entertainment standpoint, I'm kind of glad that they don't dwell more on the negative side of things and that we do get a resolution somewhat earlier on in the episode so that we can basically sort of lay back once the conflict is resolved. So at least there's that. Also, the fact that this, of all things, is what causes Twilight to become a princess, like her just solving some random spell. And especially after Twilight had made the problem so much worse by casting the spell without knowing what it did, and the fact that she got rewarded for basically coming up with a solution to a problem that she herself created. Again, I know I made jokes about that before in my April Fool's video, but it is still a legitimate problem and sort of weird how Twilight created new magic and that's how she became a princess. Like, what about Starlight, for example? Why didn't Starlight become a princess after all her machinations with creating spells over the years? So I don't know, I did find that excuse a bit arbitrary as well. So there are definitely issues with the episode, tons of issues, in fact, that make it hard for me to put it much higher than this. But it's still an episode that I enjoy quite a lot. It's sort of similar to A Heartwarming Tale, where a lot of the music is pretty good. There's a lot of good numbers in there. A True Friend is this really great climax for the series up to that point, with Twilight really getting all of her friends together and saving the day, which is pretty good. And on the whole, this is definitely a fun episode to watch. But there are enough major holes with the episode that make it hard for me to put it much higher than 82 here. Now we're moving on to number 81, and we have another episode very similar to it, and certainly one that's a bit more controversial than Magical Mystery Cure, but I did decide to give it the edge over it, and here we have the season 5 finale, The QD Remark. And I know people don't like this episode either. They don't like how Starlight's whole redemption arc here was rushed, and I do agree with that. I feel like the actual backstory is not only presented to us really fast, but the actual concept itself of Starlight becoming evil because like Sunburst left her is pretty flawed, especially with the knowledge that Starlight not only gets her own cutie mark eventually, but even gets a cutie mark that's somewhat similar to Sunburst, which really raises the question of whether the issue stemmed from the cutie mark itself or whether it was just the timing of everything. Like, I felt like it would have been much more impactful if Starlight's cutie mark was completely different from not only Sunburst, but what she wanted, and was just her parents like drifting her away from Sunburst due to the light trajectory that her cutie mark that probably wouldn't have been related to Sunburst would have brought her along that caused all this resentment to take place. But again, I know that that probably would have taken a bit more than the 30 seconds that they dedicated to on the show. But I felt like it would have really hammered home the whole point that Starlight's whole issue isn't just like the issue of timing when it comes to cutie marks, but the fact that cutie marks can sometimes send you on a trajectory that leads to unhappiness, like losing friends and not being able to dedicate as much time to doing things that you want. And obviously, there are other issues as well, like why didn't Starlight ever write letters to Sunburst? Like, I feel like they could have definitely unpacked that a bit more, so that's not great about that. And then obviously we have the whole ending of Starlight choosing the good side in things was also pretty rushed as well. But the actual scene where Starlight breaks down crying while she's threatening to tear up the spell, all while Twilight is really trying to talk her off the cliff here, is still a pretty impactful scene and one that I personally enjoy. And that leads into some of the positives as well, like all the different timelines that this presents, even though it has all the issues of most time travel stories where a lot of the changes that are made are pretty arbitrary, but they lead to arbitrarily like drastic results. You know, like it sort of makes you wonder like all the different trajectories that we lead to based on like certain things. And it does have this essentialism involved where it implies that the only good timeline is the one that we got, and that any little change can not only lead to different outcomes, but that those different outcomes can lead to inevitably worse outcomes most of the time. So that's not particularly great there. But again, I still like the creativity involved with the different timelines, seeing all the different villains from throughout the series rise to power. And on the whole, I will admit that a lot of the placement of this episode here on the list is due to bias. I do personally enjoy this episode quite a lot. I do like seeing Starlight like chasing Twilight around, creating all these new timelines, and just being a much bigger threat here than what she was before. And just seeing all this culminate like with her random cameos throughout season 5 and her running off at the end of the cutie map, all culminating in her personally getting revenge on Twilight. Not so much because it'll actually fix the problem of her losing her village and her support system, but just to get back at Twilight. And I feel like that alone was pretty interesting on its own. And obviously, we see the consequences of Starlight's own decision here, and that it doesn't even lead to a future that benefits her. Like, we even see, like, in the really bad future where everything is destroyed, that she recognizes that, like, this all is personal and that it doesn't really help her in the long term, that destroying everything just to get revenge isn't going to make her better off, and she does start to feel bad. And obviously that does lead to her like stepping down and agreeing to be Twilight student by the end of it. So while I see the flaws in the episode, and that is a big reason that this episode is lower here, I do personally enjoy it more than a lot of the other episodes, and I did decide to give it the edge over Magical Mystery Cure because I feel like despite the issues throughout the episode, I still personally enjoyed it more than Magical Mystery Cure, which is why it is at least one spot higher. But on the whole, I feel like these two episodes are pretty closely linked, both in terms of their like significance to the series, but also in terms of their issues. That does lead this episode here at number 81. Now we're moving on to number 80, and we actually have an episode that's sort of in the similar ballpark to the Cutie Remark, in that it definitely has its flaws. However, while people are generally higher in this episode than the Cutie Remark, I'm personally not, even though I still do like this episode. But here we have Slice of Life, another season 5 episode, and obviously the 100th episode of the series, though technically not based on how I'm counting the episodes, but whatever. And this is just a fine episode. I feel like a lot of your enjoyment from this episode will come down to the amount of fan service that you enjoy here and the amount of references that you end up enjoying here. As if I'm being perfectly honest, like I don't like all the references and gags here. Like I could care less about the Big Lebowski, and through that whole storyline, I could care less about Doctor Who, and through that Doctor Who's a lot of those jokes just seem to exist for those fans who like to write fan fiction about Doctor Who's there. So it's not as if this episode is necessarily for everyone, and even like the smaller stuff, like the fact that Gummy has his own monologue about this whole existential stuff, like I don't even find that personally funny. So there's that. But on the other hand, there are still other fan service stuff that I do enjoy. The whole Lyra and Bonbon scene is hilarious, especially with all the subtext and what we know about them from later on. Obviously, we have Octavia and Vinyl Scratch having their moments as well. We then get to the wedding where we see Celestia and Luna having a bit of an argument, and just the whole message of how everyone has a story and how everyone is the hero of their own story and how everyone matters is one that I do resonate with and one that I do enjoy quite a bit. So admittedly, I do like this episode a decent amount, and I do feel like it's certainly a better objectively than the Cutie Remark. But if I'm being honest, not all the jokes land for me, and I feel like your mileage may vary with this episode. So with that, I can't have it too much higher than here, but it's still a good enough episode to be here at number 80. Now moving on to number 79, and we have a very similar episode to Slice of Life. And here we have Sparkle 7, the 200th episode of the series. Though again, if we're going off my counting rules, technically it's not quite 200, but it is supposed to be 200 if we are counting the two-parters as 2 episodes. And I do feel like this one's slightly better than Slice of Life in that it's slightly less dependent on fan service and outside references. It's a mostly fun, lighthearted story, although one that's a little strange considering how much of a deal they make out of Sommer's invasion from the beginning and the end, to the point where they're making this whole security system to begin with, and the fact that they're using this stupid game in order to test it out is a bit silly in my opinion. But there's still plenty of fun to be had here with Spike and Luna building this alliance to undercut everyone so that they can win the game, which was pretty funny. And a lot of the gags here are also pretty funny, particularly with how much Twilight's freaking out over winning this game, which is also something. And we do get plenty of minor callbacks as well, like we have Rarity becoming a detective again. We also have a scene with Zephyr Breeze in it. So there's definitely some fun to be had here, and unlike something like Slice of Life, I feel like you can definitely enjoy this episode more without like having as much context with the fandom and with some of the references involved. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's still a mostly lighthearted episode, and one that can get a little weird at points and can be a bit self-congratulatory at points, which is a big reason I have it still not too high, but it is here at number 79. Now we're moving on to number 78, and we actually have two season 5 episodes in a row that are pretty similar in my opinion, in that they're mostly good episodes, but aren't necessarily my favorites, and I don't really feel like they fit into this next grouping of episodes that we'll be talking about here. But at 78, we do have Brother Who's Social. And obviously, this is a good episode and definitely is known for its ending, particularly with some of the subtext that we got beforehand, like in Do Princesses Dream of Magic Sheep, when Big Mac literally imagined himself as a super princess in order to be the hero of his own story. And then obviously, with just him in this episode saying how he used to be the apple of Apple Bloom's eye until Applejack really stood out due to her being part of the Elements of Harmony and saving Equestria a whole bunch of times, and really just overshadowing him in every way, to where now he feels like he needs to do more to impress Apple Bloom, which I do resonate with a good amount, and the ending alone is a big reason that this episode is at least this high on the list. But outside that, the episode is just fine. I mean, I know people can take it or leave it with Big Mac's whole cross-dressing thing. I'm personally in the middle, where it doesn't offend me too much, but it's also not the most interesting thing in the world. Although I do like the reveal how everyone knew that Big Mac was just cross-dressing the whole time, but due to their loose definition of sister, they let him compete anyway, and it was only through him making a mess out of everything that got him disqualified. So I'm at least glad that they went with that approach over everything else. But still, if we're taking the episode for what it is, it definitely has some good moments in there, but it's not the best in the world outside of that ending. So because of that, I do have it here at number 78. Now we're moving on to number 77, and this episode is obviously better than Brother Who's Social. It's definitely a more consistent episode, but I didn't really feel like it belonged anywhere else on the list, so I did decide to leave it here. And here we have Make New Friends But Keep Discord. And this is a fine episode, not my favorite per se, but really, it's just an episode that is there. I mean, it's pretty cool seeing like Fluttershy trying to make new friends, and then Discord is really spending a lot of the episode trying to pretend like he has other friends and that he is Mr. Popular, only by the end of it for him to basically learn his lesson that he shouldn't try to like make Fluttershy jealous of him. But honestly, despite this episode being good, I don't really have too much to say about it, and I feel like compared to the episodes we'll be talking about next, it doesn't really fit with that grouping, but I also don't feel like it's better than those episodes either. So because of that, I did decide to leave it here at number 77. Now we're moving on to number 76, and I feel like this next tier on the list is going to be episodes that are good and definitely have some merits to them, things that we could talk about, but sort of similar to a similar tier that we had in part 2. I don't necessarily have the most to say about some of these episodes, and I'm going to be going through some of them pretty quickly, but there's certainly a leg up from that grouping of episodes from the previous part. But number 76, we have probably the most flawed episode within this group, and here we have Green Isn't Your Color. And this is a good episode. I mean, the main thing I like about it is how Fluttershy and Rarity each have their own perspective on a lot of this, with Fluttershy not wanting to tell Rarity that she doesn't enjoy the celebrity lifestyle because of how invasive it is and how she doesn't really enjoy that much and how restrictive it is. And then Rarity not really wanting to say anything because she doesn't want to come off as jealous to Fluttershy when that's something that she craves. And obviously we have Twilight, who knows about all this and could very easily resolve the conflict. But since this is the episode where that introduces the Pinky Promise, it obviously prolongs the conflict much longer than it needs to. And for me, that's really the main thing keeping this episode down, is the fact that Pinky gets involved here with her like basically enforcing the Pinky Promise at every opportunity, despite the fact that this is a case where telling people things and communicating could easily resolve the conflict. But instead, we have Twilight literally going out of her way to not tell Rarity or Fluttershy what the other is thinking in order to keep this whole situation going, because she made a Pinky Promise and Pinky is there to constantly enforce that. So I don't feel like that's great, and that's obviously weighing the episode down. But I still feel like it's good enough on its own between the different perspectives of Rarity and Rarity. Not to mention, there's plenty of good comedy in here, like how Fluttershy gets so upset that she could kick something, but then obviously she's not very destructive, despite her feeling like she's destructive. So there's plenty of good stuff to be had here, but I feel like the other episodes edge it out. And because of that, it is here at number 76. Now we're moving on to number 75, and we have a largely similar episode to get into here. But here we have Pinky Apple Pie. And whenever I think of this episode, you would think it would be a better episode than what it really is. It has a good song in it. It has a pretty wholesome story for the most part. And it does have a decent conclusion, although one that's not very satisfying if you ask me. But the main thing holding this episode back is that a lot of it does seem pretty standard for a lot of it. You have the different Apple members like getting into arguments with each other, but all trying to keep under wraps so that Pinky wouldn't want to be ashamed to be part of their family. But then deep down, Pinky herself doesn't really care. And a lot of it is just things going wrong in this journey to Golden Delicious's house, like the fact that they take the wrong turn and they lose the map and the ship falls apart and stuff. So like pretty standard stuff that isn't the most interesting in the world. But and also the ending, I mean, I know it's pretty obvious and probably the best conclusion, but personally, I don't find it very satisfying the fact that the records are smudged as well, so they can never really know for sure. But like at the end of the day, it's a good episode, and plus it is noteworthy because of its song, but the actual episode itself isn't the most thrilling in the world, and because of that, it is here at 75. Now we're moving on to number 74, and we have an episode kind of similar to Pinky Apple Pie in that I think of it as a better episode than what it actually is, but it's still not a bad one. And here we have Sister Who Social, and this episode is mostly fine. Now I do have some minor issues with it, like how Sweetie Belle is constantly in the wrong during a lot of the beginning of it. Even when she goes out of her way to clean Rarity's studio, Rarity still gets mad at her by her saying that it was organized chaos and how it was her mess. I don't know, I just felt that was a bit arbitrary, even though it was kind of funny. And obviously that leads to Sweetie Belle feeling like she's never making Rarity happy. That causes her to spend all of her time with the apples and her wanting the apples to be her family instead. And obviously that's not great. And then obviously we get later on in the episode, Rarity sort of comes around, seemingly out of nowhere. She realizes that what she was doing was wrong and she tries to make things right with Sweetie Belle. But Sweetie Belle isn't impressed by Rarity, and it only takes her competing in the event in order to really win back Sweetie Belle. But something I will give this episode some credit for is we even see Applejack see through all this and see how it isn't right for Sweetie Belle to sort of disown Rarity like that. And the fact that Applejack is that good of a sport, even with Sweetie Belle accepting her and wishing that she were her big sister instead, is pretty nice to see. But honestly, I feel like this episode is good, but not great, as I'm sure some people might see it. So because of that, I do have it here at number 74. Now we're moving on to number 73, and we have a very early episode to talk about. And here we have Call the Cutie, and this is obviously a pretty notable episode. It was supposed to be a backdoor pilot for the CMC to have their own series, but obviously that didn't quite go through. And this is a mostly good episode as well, with us being introduced to Apple Bloom, and along with that, her trying to find her cutie mark only to come up short. And obviously by the end, she ends up being the CMC. She's able to get a 1-up on Diamond Tiara during her quinceanera, and that's just kind of it. I feel like it's a good episode, not too much bad to say about it, but it's just kind of there. And I feel like other episodes are more actively good than it, and I can't really have it higher than number 73 here. Now we're moving on to number 72, and we have another pretty similar episode in one season afterwards, but here we have Read It and Weep, and it's a pretty standard episode. Rainbow Dash gets injured, she learns how to read, she learns to appreciate reading, and then spends the rest of the episode trying to hide the fact that she likes reading because she doesn't want to be an egghead, which is pretty amusing, but it's a mostly standard story of Rainbow Dash learning that not just eggheads can read, and maybe deep down it's not a bad thing to be an egghead. It is sort of amusing how she's willing to go so far as to break into the hospital to steal the book when she very easily could have just gone to Golden Oaks and gotten it there instead, but she didn't want to be caught. And I do like some of the segments as well when she's reading the book, and it's sort of like a movie with us seeing Daring Do in action and her going on the adventures, and Rainbow Dash is slowly falling in love with the series and the very concept of reading. But at the end of the day, it's a very standard story, and while it is executed well, and while it is somewhat entertaining, It's nothing too special, and because of that, it is here number 72. Now we're moving on to number 71, and we actually have another early Rainbow Dash episode, but one that's a bit more interesting. And here we have Sonic Rainboom. And the main thing I will give this episode is it does present Rainbow in an interesting light here, with her increasingly getting stage fright due to these bullies, like just reminding her of how much she was ridiculed as a filly. And in general, the whole backstory of Rainbow Dash being someone who used to be bullied despite her vibrato is an interesting one. Now, along the way, we also get that whole side story of Rarity being the only one that can actually fly, because it turns out that that spell that Twilight cast was like only good enough for one because of how energy intensive it was, while she was able to come up with a much better spell that allowed the others to travel across Cloudsdale. But Rarity herself didn't want to like get that because she liked how stylish she looked. And in general, Rarity just being overconfident in a lot of the episode and only making the problem with Rainbow Dash worse, to where Rainbow Dash doesn't feel confident at all, and Rarity even enters in the contest feeling like her flying ability and just beauty will allow her to win herself over. But then by the end, like, she just looks really gaudy with all her makeup and the way in which she's just flying too close to the sun, which eventually causes her wings to break, and for Rainbow Dash to swoop in, regain her confidence enough to not only save Rarity, but rescue the Wonderbolts and create the Sonic Rainboom that she created as a child, and just in general impressing the Wonderbolts in the process. So again, mostly solid episode, not really one that stands out to me as a great episode, but certainly a good enough one to be here at number 71. Now we're moving on to number 70. We actually have an episode that has dropped a good amount since the last time I talked about it, as it's still a good episode, but probably not as great as I measured it the last time I talked about it. But here we have Dragon Shy, and this is still a good episode. It's still fun seeing Fluttershy being nervous for a lot of it, all while the rest of the main six are trying to build her confidence, only for at the end for Fluttershy to build her confidence and just yell at the dragon when she sees the rest of her friends getting hurt by the dragon just messing with them. So it's still a good episode in that regard, but I think the more that I think about it, this episode is not as entertaining as I gave it credit for. I feel like there's a bit more slow periods within it. And yes, while there's still some good stuff in it, like Pinky's hop, skip, and a jump song and stuff like that, there's also the element of her friends basically forcing all this upon Fluttershy. The fact that they're not really so much encouraging her initially, and that they're basically just sending her here against her will, and how they even come around to see Fluttershy as a hindrance and how she's holding them back. And, that's not ideal. So I feel like through that, I definitely dropped the episode a good amount because of that. It's still a good enough episode and a good enough early episode to where I at least have it here at number 70. Now we're moving on to number 69, and we have another episode very similar to Dragon Shy, where it's in a relatively early episode, and one that's good but not all-time great. And here we have Sweet and Elite. And I do like this episode as well. Now, the actual message is a bit standard, with Rarity kind of learning to not be ashamed of her friends despite their rustic roots. And I do feel like, to a degree, it's not great that they play up the whole rustic roots in this episode, with them being complete slobs, and even Twilight just completely making a fool out of herself whenever they go to the garden party. And obviously it has the whole thing of Rarity going back and forth between the birthday party and the garden party, like sort of a classic like gag of her like going back and forth and having to keep up appearances, all while not really enjoying either of them because she's so busy going back and forth. But on the whole, it's still a good episode. It has a decent song by showing just how Rarity is impacted by her feeling like an important pony. And obviously it's pretty good at the end when she admits to like the fact that these are her friends, and she never fully sells out the main six despite her like not wanting people to know that she's friends with these buffoons. And I do like how Fancy Pants does accept her by the end of it, and we obviously see those other ponies like basically being a bunch of sycophants and really showing just how like obnoxious a lot of the high society is. So it's definitely a good episode, but not one that I would have in too high a regard. And because of that, it is here number 69. Now we're moving on to number 68, and we are jumping a bit forward now to another episode that is mostly good, but honestly, I don't have too much to say about it. And here we have Rarity Takes Manhattan. And this is a good episode. Now, admittedly, it's not my personal favorite. Like, there's still some good moments in there. Like, we see like Suri take advantage of Rarity's generosity by basically stealing all of her designs after she extended some help. There's also the song, which is pretty good and really highlights Rarity as a character, which has a pretty nice follow up later on in the episode with the reprise and the ending where Rarity basically gives up the competition or walks out of it, only to find out at the end that she won and that Coco quit her job. So there's some plenty of good stuff in there. Now, there is also some negativity in here, like when Rarity basically forces her friends to work overnight to make a new line. And then at the end, when like they are able to put on a new show, I mean, that's also a pretty good moment, and a good way to make up for what Rarity did and how she basically let a lot of her own hubris get to her head there. But it's still a good episode, and while it's not my personal favorite, it's still good enough to be here at number 68. Now we're moving on to number 67, and we have a very similar episode to Rarity Takes Manhattan, and here we have To Change a Changeling. And I do like this episode a good amount. It has some good moments in it, particularly that feeling forum scene. You also have Starlight's big rallying speech towards the rest of the changelings once Pharynx leaves, only for no one to really show up. And in general, this is a pretty solid episode. And while it's not necessarily my favorite, it does have some good moments within it. And because of that, I do have it here at number 67. Now we're moving on to number 66. And admittedly, this episode is more flawed than the last two episodes we talked about, but one that I do personally enjoy more. But here we have testing, 1, 2, 3. And my big issue with the episode is the way the ending is handled, where I feel like it was both kind of slow, but also pretty rushed, where we literally saw basically the same scene play out 3 times back to back to back, where first we had the whole moment of establishing that Rainbow Dash can observe things as she's flying, like, and obviously Twilight putting those pieces together. Then she has Rainbow go on another like flight with her while Rainbow Dash is observing like all the like prep materials and all the content being presented on the ground. And then we literally rewind again to show all the content playing out and establishing that Rainbow Dash was absorbing all the material that she needs for the test. Again, we basically have the same scene playing out several times in a row, and I don't like how that's presented there, but to be fair, I'm not too sure how they could have done it better than that per se. But still, something that slows down the episode. And the actual test is handled very, very quickly, where she takes the test, the proctor just gives her the A, and then the episode immediately ends afterwards. So, very weird ending to that. But I do like this episode, all things considered. There's a lot of funny scenes where each of the main 6 are trying to help Rainbow Dash study for the test. You have Rainbow failing to connect with each of the approaches. All the while, she increasingly feels like she's too stupid to be a Wonderbolt and how she's going to lose out on her dream because she can't learn and that she thinks her head is full of rocks. So, which is pretty relatable and is sort of hard to watch at points, but again, it's part of what makes this episode really interesting in my eyes. And also just seeing the different techniques in play, like how Twilight is trying to use a more traditional classroom method, while Rarity is focusing all in on the costumes. Pinky makes like in this 90s style rap to try to get her to remember the material. And it's just interesting seeing how Rainbow Dash reacts to each of this, eventually culminating in her realizing that she has her own way of learning. And I know there are plenty of fans that resonate with this episode to a degree. I'm one of them, and I do like Rainbow Dash's struggle throughout this episode, and that's a big reason I have it at least as high on the list. But admittedly, there are still some technical issues with it, particularly the way the ending is handled from a pacing standpoint, which is a big reason that this episode falls to number 66 here. Now we're moving on to number 65, and we have an episode that I like, however, it's not the best in execution. But here we have Daring Done. And I do appreciate this episode in that it does introduce the idea that maybe Daring Do's work isn't always as heroic as it seems, where we see this village getting very upset that Daring Do destroyed this statue of Sonambula and how Sonambula meant a lot to this town, given how she always had hope and she never gave up hope. And it's such a big deal for them, like this whole story. And I do like how they use this to set up Sonambula and introduce her, which obviously comes back later in the finale. And I do like how the town's ponies have a point here, and that like a lot of Daring Do's work can come off as a bit like destructive to local cultures. Now, the one knock I do have against this episode is we do see at the end that like Cabaleron was behind it all and how he was the one peddling all this anger, and how once this whole conflict is resolved, that seems to make all those problems go away. So I do knock it because of that, but I still like the idea that they were going for, and I am glad that it is later followed up upon in season 9, so at least here's that. But as it is, this is definitely a good episode, but one that is not my favorite, and because of that, it is here number 65. Now we're moving on to number 64, and we have another episode that I do like, but one that does have some minor issues here and there. But here we have the parent map from season 8. And my biggest issue with this episode is it's very obvious from early on that the real conflict is between Starlight, Sunburst, and their parents. And they do spend a decent chunk of the episode trying to figure out what the problem is. They even think at one point it's between their parents, only for it to be very obvious by the end that it really was between themselves and the parents. So, again, that's a bit of an issue. Also, I feel like they could have done more to expand upon Starlight and her father's relationship. I feel like there was much left on the table in terms of like Fireflight's reaction to the fact that her daughter, like, not only like lost track of things, but went on to become this evil, like, leader of a cult, basically. I felt like they could have done more with that. They could have done more with like showing like where things went wrong. And yeah, we do get that minor like sight of like Starlight's old room where it did seem like she went through an emo phase, probably in response to her not having any friends because Sunburst left. But even so, I still like this episode. It's still interesting seeing just how rocky Starlight's relationship with her father is, and Sunburst in turn with his mother. And actually, something I do give the episode credit for is I do feel like the conflict on Sunburst's side of things is handled pretty well, with his mother not wanting him to experience the same failure again after he dropped out of magic school. While I feel like more of my issues stem from Starlight's side of things, which I felt like could have been much more interesting. But as it is fine. Like, I do like this episode, but with it having some missed potential, I do feel like I had to leave it a bit lower on the list. And because of that, it is here at number 64. Now we're moving on to number 63. And I'm a little surprised that this episode is as high as it is, given how I don't have that great of an opinion on it. But it's still good enough to be here. And here we have the beginning of the end. And it's not as if I love this episode per se, but it is technically one of the better episodes of the series, and there are good things about it. I do like the whole dilemma during part 2 when the main six are trying to fend off the other town's ponies after they get brainwashed by Sombra, but they don't want to actually hurt them because they're still people that they care about. I do like Discord's whole scheme, especially with the context of how he orchestrated all of this and how this was all part of his plan of getting all these villains together to try and test Twilight one more time. In his whole speech, giving each of the main six some words of wisdom is another sign that he was doing all this in order to test them. So I do at least appreciate that. And I do like how this whole conflict comes into play with Sombra taking over Equestria and him trying to prove that he doesn't need Grogar's help, that he could do it all by himself. And by the end, when he fails and the main six do able to defeat him, that Grogar is able to use him as an example in order to encourage the evil trio to stick together, which obviously leads into the whole storyline season 9 of them working together and using friendship in order to overthrow Grogar and eventually allow this situation to get out of hand. But admittedly, I also think it also suffers from the fact that this is season 9, the fact that the main six just happen to be so worried about their loved ones at this point in the series when they didn't seem to be as worried before, even though this is far from the only time in which they are put into direct danger. I mean, To Where and Back Again comes directly to mind in that regard, but it is still a decent two-parter and a decent episode in the grand scheme of things, and it's for that reason that I have it here at number 63. Now we're moving on to number 62, and these next 3 episodes are all pretty good in their own right, and they do have interesting ideas, though I feel like in execution they're probably not the best and the most entertaining, but they're still pretty good. And number 62, we have Rock Solid Friendship. And the main thing I like about this episode is seeing Starlight and Maud interact, seeing their natural chemistry play out to where Starlight is able to become friends with Maud, but just through Pinky constantly getting in the way that really gets things going downhill. Now, I will admit that this episode does kind of suffer from a few minor issues. Like, I don't like how like Starlight and Ma just happened to meet back when Starlight was still evil. Like the way in which they just connected it back to Starlight's past isn't ideal. And we even see Pinky making a joke afterwards about how Ma shouldn't say anything about how she helped Starlight become as evil as she was and as powerful as she was. So that's not great. And also Pinky just being overbearing. Like, why is she being overbearing of all times? Like, I get that she wants Ma to live in Ponyville and for her to really make this work, but it's obviously not great to see Pinky acting that way. And outside that, like, this episode probably isn't as interesting as certain other episodes we'll be talking about soon, but I still feel like it executes pretty well. Like, I do still like seeing Starlight and Maud interact. I really love Starlight really calling out Pinky for all her actions later on the episode, where she tries to applying the lesson that she learned in All Bottled Up by being completely honest, but just completely hurting Pinky's feelings in the process, noting how she kinda, sort of, got in the way, and then Pinky gets offended by that, and then she tries to recover with, let's go with, you ruined everything all the time, which is pretty funny. And then Starlight tries to make it sound like, ta-da, friendship lesson learned. I don't know, I just find that scene pretty funny. So on the whole, this is definitely a good episode and definitely a pretty solid spot within the top half of the list, but I feel like other episodes have more interesting ideas in it, and plus, it still has enough minor flaws with its premise to where I do have it here number 62. Now moving on to number 61, and I can see some people saying this episode is a bit too high, but I do like a lot of the ideas that this episode was presenting, even if I don't feel like it was presented in necessarily the most interesting way. But here we have Apple Family Reunion, and I do like this episode more than most people. I do like the whole concept of Applejack really wanting to uphold this tradition of the Apple family reunion by trying to make it as memorable as possible and for them to create as many memories as possible. And she does it by basically making everyone a cog in this machine where rather than having things happen organically, she's basically just manufacturing everything to make everything as grand as possible, like having all the older people just knitting quilts the whole time rather than like allowing them to talk while they make things. She forces everyone to play games when they don't really want to, just so that she can have the picture for the scrapbook. And in general, just seeing all this come together does present some interesting ideas about how nostalgia works, how traditions are made, and how people ultimately remember things. I mean, I guess to connect this to my own life, I mean, I sort of remember like when I was younger that our town had like greater traditions, and usually when I thought of it, I would think of everyone as playing their own part and everyone just doing what they needed to make these grand things to come together, all these grand activities and all these grand gestures within it, rather than seeing these people as individuals who, like still did things on the side, people who like weren't solely focused on the acts, but were focused more so on their relationships. And I guess like I could see that drive by Applejack to try to make this all come together. Now, admittedly, the episode itself isn't the most entertaining consistently. There are definitely some slow stretches within there, but I still like it for what it is. I mean, we obviously have Applejack really trying to make this work, and we even get some side stuff as well, like Apple Bloom and Bads being friends and how they're trying to make the most of it. And they're the ones who help Applejack realize that it's more so about the people than about the traditions themselves. So I do like that aspect to it, and on the whole, this is a solid episode. But I feel like other episodes are more consistently entertaining than it, and because of that, I do have it here number 61. Now we're moving on to number 60, and we have an episode that's very similar to Apple Family Reunion and has very similar themes to Apple Family Reunion. And here we have Maid in Manhattan, and this is another episode that I do resonate more with a lot of other people. It has very similar themes, and that a lot of it focuses on traditions and how traditions have fallen by the wayside. And I feel like that aspect to it is more interesting, where rather than perpetuating a tradition that has already been ongoing, we do see someone like Coco come along who is trying to resurrect something that's been lost to time. And I do find that more interesting than what we saw in Apple Family Reunion. Again, connecting this back to my own life. I mean, a lot of the traditions that I just talked about with Apple Family Reunion, those ended up going into decline over time as people moved away, as people grew up, and it was basically thrust upon the next generation to make those traditions like remain in place. And I feel like through that, that brought back tons of memories about like the old days and sort of comparing how we are stacking up compared to those old days. And through that, I do relate to what Coco's trying to do. She's trying to bring back the glory behind it all. And we do see like Rarity and Applejack coming along to help her out in that regard. But also, like, this is a friendship problem episode. And we do see Applejack really trying to figure out why she was summoned here. And to be fair, I feel like that was probably one of the less interesting parts of the episode, but still was an interesting through line in all this. We obviously see them putting on the play, and while like things didn't go right to where eventually they had to settle for a very simple set and very simple costumes, we do see the relationships be the things that bring things back together, where we just see people walking by and just seeing the play happening, and that's what caused them to remember it. And I do find that aspect to be interesting as well, though to be fair, I feel like they could have done a bit more to set that up, about how there's this gap in like culture that made people want to gravitate towards something like this. So I feel like they could have done a bit more and gone a bit more in depth with it. Though I still feel like in execution, it did it pretty well by Coco showing off her scrapbook and showing pictures of her as a kid, like taking part in the play and the traditions. So overall, this is an episode that probably on its own is not the most exceptional or the most entertaining in the world, but it's still an episode that I relate a lot to, and that's what makes this episode pretty interesting in my eyes. But still, I feel like the episodes we'll be talking about soon are more interesting and have more to offer. And it's because of that I have it here at number 60. Now we're moving on to number 59, and I kind of debated where to put this episode, as it's an episode that I do like, and definitely an episode that's better than I remember it as, but still compared to other episodes, I feel like there are other episodes that simply outclass it. But here we have the season 3 premiere, The Crystal Empire. And I do like this episode a lot. It's a pretty solid two-parter where a lot of it does focus on the crystal ponies and how they had this culture that's been lost to time, which again does make it pretty similar to the last two episodes we talked about. However, something that I do hold against it to a degree is how Twilight is taking this as a test. And through that, you could see that maybe she's not taking the concerns of this mission as seriously as she probably should, as she's focused more on the test side of things than anything else. But still, this is your typical two-parter. So through that, you have plenty of increased stakes. Like you have plenty of fun villains, like with Sombra here, like threatening the Crystal Empire. And it's sort of this slow burn, but rather than it being like this big attack, we do see Sombra slowly closing in on the Empire. And a lot of the episode is about not only restoring the Crystal Hearts so that they can ward off Sombra, but also trying to keep the Crystal Ponies ignorant of the fact that they don't have the Crystal Heart, as a big reason why Sombra is able to remain out is because the Crystal Ponies are retained to some level of hope, which again is offering some protection to the kingdom. So I do find that interesting. We then get to the nightmare door where Twilight has to face her worst fear, being rejected by Celestia, and Celestia outright disowning her, which is a pretty iconic scene. But then immediately afterward, we have an even more interesting moment where Spike gets to see the door and he lives out his worst fear of Twilight rejecting him and being kicked out and no longer having a family. And I always love how we don't actually see that fear playing out. We just see Spike's reaction to it and how he's just yelling and crying, like he's just walking back in terror the whole time. Like, I do love that visual as well, and the way they present that is pretty strong. And I do like how Spike is the one who is ultimately able to save the day. How a lot of the lesson here is Twilight letting go of her ego and just letting Spike be the one to save the day, as he's the only one that's able to do so after she's incapacitated. And then Spike's able to save the Crystal Empire, ward off Sombra, and become a celebrity in his own right, which is obviously a key element that comes back in future episodes. There's also like the whole song. Both songs really pretty good. Like there's the failure song that plays at the beginning, but also the Ballad of the Crystal Ponies that plays towards the end of part 1, which I feel like is a pretty solid song there. Now, admittedly, I still feel like the worst part of the episode is during part 2, where we see the rest of the main 6 trying to distract the ponies while like they're looking for the Crystal Heart. And yes, while I did say earlier that's interesting that the ponies have to remain ignorant in order to hold on to hope, we still have some pretty slow segments of the main five, like basically putting on the carnival while like they're trying to keep things like all nice and orderly. So I did find that a bit boring. But on the whole, I still feel like this is a solid two-parter. This is a solid episode with some interesting ideas, but I feel like other episodes are simply more interesting than it. And because of that, I do have it here at number 59. Now we're moving on to number 58, and we actually have 3 episodes in a row that are mostly lighthearted and episodes that are mostly noted for their comedy, more so than having truly interesting character moments, with one exception, but we'll get into that in a moment. But at number 58, I did decide to go with Mystery on the Friendship Express. And I know people don't like this episode as much, and there are certainly issues with it, namely the fact that the main five like couldn't really contain their own appetites, and they should have realized that like this was a very big deal and that Pinky was really taking it seriously to make sure that this cake got to Canterlot in one piece, only for them to give in to their own temptations and obviously mess everything up. And even the compromise they come up with at the end by forcing all the other competitors to like cobble together their creations to make it one entry when I'm sure they all wanted to try to win it for themselves is probably not ideal. So there are definitely issues with this episode that keep it lower on the list. But the main reason I have it at least as high is it's still very entertaining. It's still very fun seeing Pinky trying to get to the bottom of it, while Twilight is the one who's actually finding out a lot of the clues. It's interesting seeing Pinky coming up with all these stories about how each of the suspects was able to like distract her or incapacitate her while they're able to take a massive bite out of the cake. And I do love the general mystery aspect of it. This is a very mostly lighthearted and very fun episode to get through, but it's those little issues of the characters like not like taking Pinky's concerns seriously that does leave it a bit lower, and it is here at number 58. Now we're moving on to number 57, and we have a very similar episode to Mystery on the Friendship Express, and one that's a bit more controversial. I'm sure plenty of people were not too happy that this episode was this high on its respective season episode ranking, but I still love this episode a lot. And here we have A Trivial Pursuit, and I do love this episode as well. It's another mostly lighthearted episode. Now, yes, it's not great that Twilight isn't treating Pinky the best, and obviously you can tell that Pinky was really excited to play this game, and especially with Twilight, but Twilight just gets so caught up in trying to be the first to win 3 in a row that she ends up hurting Pinky's feelings, and obviously that whole ending where she tells Pinky off gets her disqualified, and then Pinky's just sad for a bit, only for Twilight to eventually come back, is probably not ideal. But this is still a very funny episode, very lighthearted for the most part. A lot of really funny faces. I know I already made such a big deal about the faces and how this is very iconic for season 9 to have this really wacky animation style, and that this episode really doubles down on that. And plus, there's plenty of fun callbacks to the rest of the series as well. A lot of fun banter between the different teams, like particularly not just with the rules, but also the different like questions that are asked. So there's plenty of fun to be had in this episode, even if Twilight herself comes off as a bit mean-spirited at points. And it's for that reason I do have this episode at least here at number 57. Now we're moving on to number 56, and this is another episode that fits within this tier of mostly lighthearted episodes. Although this episode definitely has a bit more character behind it and a bit more serious stuff going on. But here we have The Gift of the Maud Pie. And this episode is another really funny one. I mean, you have that entire scene of Rarity freaking out after Maud decides that she's excited by a crack. I mean, you have Rarity literally bouncing back and forth, trying to get Maud all this stuff, like asking if she's impressed by any of it, only for Maud to say that she was impressed by the crack. And just how long it takes for Maud to say this, to pick up the camera and take a picture of it, the fact that it flashes, and then once the flash like recedes, that it cuts to Rarity's face as she slowly like twitches and tries to make sense of it all, and then she eventually yells, "What?" Like just exasperated that out of all the great stuff that she picked out, that Maud just happened to pick the crack was very funny on its own. You also have stuff like Maud just magically transporting herself. You have the fact that Maud is asking Pinky like what happened to her party cannon, and then Rarity is accidentally spills the beans, like accidentally leaks out the truth seemingly out of nowhere, where she's saying, "Oh, look at all the stuff that Pinky had to give up in order to get this pouch for you." And then like Maud just demands to know, but then Rarity ends up leaking more information. And then later on, when she goes to get the party cannon back, she keeps like magically appearing from off frame, really showing the similarities between Maud and Pinky in that regard. So I do find that aspect pretty interesting. And just in general, the way that Rarity is hyping up Maud as this really scary and intimidating person that allows her to get the party cannon back is all very funny. There's a lot of good humor in this episode, but also good character stuff as well, where Pinky is really preoccupied with making sure that she gets the best possible gift from Maud. She gets really self-conscious about the fact that Maud always gets her the best gifts, but she's never able to reciprocate, which is something that I very much relate to, where I feel like I'm never able to give back when I get so much from others. So I do relate to Pinky in that regard, and I can really sympathize with the extent that she's willing to sacrifice in order to get Maud what she wants. And then when Maud like refuses it and gets back what Pinky wanted, but gives up the thing that she got in the process, Pinky again gets very self-conscious, and it really just highlights how strong their relationship is. The way that Maud is able to reassure her by saying that it doesn't matter what you get me, like it's really just the thought that counts, and just being here with you is what matters. So I do like that. And really, this is a pretty wholesome episode. A lot of good humor and a lot of good character stuff as well. But I still feel like other episodes top it, and I feel like it sort of belongs in this mostly humorous category of episodes. And it's for that reason I do have it here at number 56. Now we're moving on to number 55, and admittedly, I don't have as much to say about this two-parter as anything else, but it's still a good episode. And here we have School Raise. And I do like this episode. Now, admittedly, it doesn't stand out to the same degree as other two-parters that we'll be getting into soon. However, it still has some good things going for it. You have Kozuko really implementing her idea that friendship can be used as a tool, though admittedly I feel like this idea is expanded upon more in other episodes, but we'll get into those soon enough. I do like that Neisei does see the flaws in his worldview, where he assumes that only ponies should be able to learn about friendship, and that only ponies can use friendship for good. Again, sort of being racist, and him sort of like capitalizing off stereotypes of other creatures, which admittedly I feel like they could have done a bit more of, but I'm kind of glad that wasn't too overbearing. Only to see that even ponies can be evil, and that even ponies can use friendship taught at the friendship school in order to do bad things. And the fact that the Creature Six were able to save the day is enough to convince him that maybe that his worldview is a bit flawed, and that he does have a bit of a redemption arc there. And just in general, this is a solid two-parter. Now, admittedly, he does have some slow parts as well. Like, I feel like a lot of the stuff in Tartarus is pretty mundane for the most part. And then also the ending where they choose to send Cozy Glow to Tartarus simply because she refuses redemption despite her being a little child isn't ideal either. But for what it is, it's still a solid two-parter, and because of that, I do have it here at number 55. Now we're moving on to number 54, and we have a pretty good episode, although one that, again, doesn't stand out to me too much, particularly when I'm not watching it in the moment. But here we have Bloom and Gloom, and I believe I did drop this a bit from when I talked about my CMC videos, though you can double check me on that, as I really feel like the more I think about it, this is probably the CMC Luna episode that stands out the least to me, despite the fact that it's the final one and the one that really culminates this mini arc across the last couple seasons. And there's still some plenty of good moments in there. Like, you have all of Apple Bloom's nightmares of her getting the wrong cutie mark. Though even then, I feel like there's some slow points in there. Like the first dream of her like getting the beekeeper like cutie mark is like pretty boring. Like, so there are still some slow moments in there, but there are still some iconic moments there. You have like Scootaloo realizing she's in a dream, so she tries flying. You have like the nightmare where Apple Bloom gets a non-Apple cutie mark and the family disowns her. You have Applejack's lullaby that she sings to her, like reassuring her that it doesn't matter what cutie mark she gets. So there are still some good moments in here, and at the end of the day, this is a solid episode. But I definitely feel like the entertainment value is not as strong with it. There are definitely some slower moments within it, and it's for that reason that I have it here at number 54. Now we're moving on to number 53, and we kind of have a similar episode to Bloom and Gloom, where it is pretty good, and I did have it a bit higher in my previous estimation than what I have it now, but here we have A Health of Information. And I did drop this episode a bit as well, simply because the entertainment wasn't as strong as certain other episodes we'll be talking about soon, where it's still a good episode. I wouldn't say it's boring per se, though there are a few more slow moments than I gave it credit for at the time. And sort of similar to Bloom and Gloom, a lot of it does exist to establish Meadowbrook, like one of the pillars that will come back in the season finale. But there's still some interesting stuff that happens in it. Like you have Fluttershy taking on all this guilt over Zecora getting sick and her trying so hard to cure the disease, only for her to get sick in the process. And I know people have pointed out that the whole self-care message kind of falls flat when you know that Zecora is really in danger and that there's this time constraint for Fluttershy to make Zecora feel better before she literally dies and turns into a tree. And obviously the whole idea that Fluttershy becomes sick and that this disease eventually turns her into a tree, sort of a weird callback to Over a Barrel back in season 1, but that's just me. But it's still a solid episode, and while I can't say it's the most entertaining in the world, it's still one that gives some value in terms of its character development, in terms of its story. That does leave it here at number 53. Now we're moving on to number 52, and this is an episode that I still really enjoy, honestly a bit more than the last two episodes we talked about, but I still feel like there's some room for it to be better. But here we have Celestial Advice, the season 7 premiere. And I do like this episode as well. It has some pretty fun moments in it, like all the different nightmare scenarios that Twilight comes up for Starlight to screw up on her own. I did find that pretty amusing. Obviously, Celestia's big reveal that she was also very nervous and she also was pretty panicked when she was deciding what to do with Twilight, but then literally decided the last possible moment to send her off to Ponyville, even knowing that Twilight is going to be critical towards ensuring that Equestria be saved. Now I know some people have knocked this episode to a degree because it basically suggests that she handpicked the main six to be Twilight's friends, but considering that they were already shown to be connected through destiny with the Sonic Rain Boom, I guess it kind of makes sense, but even so, I know some people don't like that. And the other thing that people will point to is all Discord's antics with him spreading the rumor around the party that Twilight has this big announcement concerning Starlight, and it obviously puts all this unneeded pressure on Twilight to have something ready for Starlight, with her thinking that she needs to literally send Starlight off, much like Celestia did with her, only for the end to have her decide to simply have her graduate, but still give her the option to live at the castle with her, which she obviously ends up accepting. And there's also the big moment where Twilight gives Starlight her gift, which is all the pictures that are posted on the mirror, which is a pretty heartfelt moment there. So this is definitely a solid episode as well, and certainly more entertaining than Bloom and Gloom or Health of Information, but I still feel like it doesn't quite crack the top tier for me, and because of that, it is here at number 52. Now we're moving on to number 51, and we definitely have an episode that I have more to say than the last couple episodes, though it's certainly a bit more flawed than the last couple episodes. But here we have, from season 9, Between Dark and Dawn, and I do like this episode a lot, and there's plenty of cool stuff within it. I really like the song, it's very catchy, there's a lot of cool visuals, both during the song and just throughout the episode, and just seeing all these random ponies get really awestruck when they just see the princesses out and about is really cool, and also leads to plenty of fun moments there. There's even this cool visual towards the end when Celestia is just doing stuff on her own after getting in her fight with Luna, where these ponies that she's parachuting with, they end up having this parachute with the two sisters on it, which I did find pretty cute. And just in general, the whole story of seeing Celestia and Luna just acting like sisters in this episode more so than rulers, and them just exploring the land and really getting out of the castle, only to run into their different styles for how they want to do the vacation, was pretty interesting and pretty organic as well, with Celestia surprisingly being willing to do all this action and all this thrill-seeking stuff, which is pretty in character with her, while Luna wants to be more reserved and do more relaxing things like sitting on the beach and just taking it slow, and obviously that leads to plenty of conflict there. So there's plenty of fun there, and even though they do end up getting in a fight and end up going their separate ways, I still found it pretty organic, and I do find it to actually help the episode in terms of them teaching the lesson. but also like the scene where they're trying to do their own stuff and they just realize that they simply can't do it alone and that they need each other to prevent Luna from getting a sunburn from not putting on sunscreen, or Celestia just getting completely scared and lost in the woods because Luna isn't there to guide her. So I did find that pretty interesting. Now, admittedly, the main thing that slows this episode down, the main reason that it's lower on the list, is the side plot with Twilight having to take over like their responsibilities while they're away, and really her dropping the ball with putting together this gala and her just dismissing the committee, thinking that she has to do it all by herself, and then like her just completely screwing everything up, and then her eventually realizing that she literally doesn't have to do everything by herself and that she could simply delegate. And there's that whole moment where she delegates and she has that really evil look on her face as she says, "Now this is delegating," which is pretty funny, but really this whole side plot is pretty boring if you ask me, and a big reason why this episode isn't more entertaining than it is. But obviously it does make up for it by the end, especially with Twilight trying to switch between the sun and the moon, but her completely screwing up the spell there, and her just getting more funny faces as she's trying to use the turner but breaking it, which is pretty funny, but also like pretty consistent with her storyline there. So this is a pretty consistently entertaining episode, and I do like it quite a lot. But again, I feel like it does get a bit boring at points, and also I feel like compared to other episodes we'll be talking about soon, it just doesn't quite add up for me. And because of that, it is here at number 51. And with that, we are now inside the top 50. Again, another big milestone for this list. And certainly that won't be the last time I say this here, but just to give you an idea of where we are in terms of progress on this list, and we are starting to get into some better episodes here. Although at number 50, this episode still has plenty of holes in it, and I know I've complained about this episode before, despite me really liking it. But here we have the season 2 finale, A Candlelight Wedding. And I've been pretty critical about this episode before. I mean, I think the biggest issue is with Twilight and the fact that she was technically right for the wrong reasons here, where she does say that like the fake Cadence was pretty bad and pretty rude, despite others not really seeing that for a lot of it. But at no point does she ever assume that she was outright evil. And I felt like it would have been one thing if Twilight did see the way that quote unquote Cadence was acting and assume that that is not how the real Cadence would act and that something is terribly wrong here. But just others think she's completely ridiculous, even though she doesn't really have much evidence to base her claims that there's more than just her outgrowing like her nice self. But still, when the whole message of the episode is to trust your gut, the fact that Twilight like takes like this bad information that the fake Cadence is giving her and concludes that the real Cadence is what she's seeing, and that that real Cadence has simply just become a bad apple as she has gotten older, isn't the best look in the world and probably not a great sign for her, even if that probably is one of the more realistic reactions. Although it's probably not great that the episode was trying to go for that approach here. Also, Twilight doesn't look the best either when she is coming off as a bit jealous that Shining Arbor didn't give her a personal invitation before sending out the invitations to the other wedding guests, which I did find a bit of a knock there. So there are issues with this episode in terms of its message, the way that's delivered, and just Twilight not being super likable throughout a lot of this episode. But if we're taking that out, this is still a pretty strong two-parter. I mean, it's definitely one of the more cinematic episodes within the early parts of the series here. And there's a pretty good song in here as well with both BBBFF in part 1 and then This Day's Aria in part 2. We obviously get introduced to Cadence in this episode. And when it was interesting seeing Twilight initially assume that she was evil, only for the real Cadence at the beginning of part 2 to quickly prove that she was the real deal and that she had really been this good person this whole time, despite what the fake Cadence was getting off during a lot of part 1. So at least there's that. And I know also people say that the ending of part 1 wasn't the best either, with Twilight coming in with all these wild accusations, and then everyone just getting completely mad at her and completely ditching her, which obviously has been the source of many fan fictions written after the fact. And honestly, if I had been part of the fandom at the time that this episode was coming out, there's a good chance I could have been one of those people writing fanfics about this particular episode. But again, a number of people beat me to the punch there. So, really, this episode is pretty solid for the most part, and I do feel like it benefits a lot from it being a two-parter in terms of its story, in terms of its scope, and in terms of a lot of the action that's taking place during it. But it's those big knocks of Twilight not being the most likable person throughout a lot of it, and plus there just being a disconnect between the message and the way that's delivered during a lot of it, especially when you consider the fact that obviously the other ponies other than Twilight were going off their gut reactions as well during a lot of part one, but were obviously proven wrong. And it was Twilight who was technically right, but didn't have all the information, but yet the episode wants us to believe that she had all the information to make the proper judgment. That does knock this episode to a degree, and it's for that reason that I do have it here at number 50. Now moving on to number 49, and we have another episode kind of similar to A Camelot Wedding, where it is mostly good and it is pretty entertaining throughout, but it is a bit messy as well and probably not ideal. But here we have Every Little Thing She Does, and I will admit I am a bit of a defender when it comes to this episode. I do find it interesting how Starlight is so obsessed with the individual tasks and how she feels like she needs to do well at the tasks in order to pass the friendship lessons and to make the others like be happy with her performance, and she completely loses sight of everything and literally resorts to magic in order to like mind control the ponies into just going through the tasks and trying to get all the friendship lessons done at once, which is pretty humorous. I do like the way that the mind controlled ponies act while they're under mind control, like particularly Pinky, where she has this really pleasant but robotic sounding voice, which is both pretty funny but also pretty like creepy when you think about it. And obviously the fact that they're pretty literal minded. In fact, they'll do pretty much exactly what Starlight does, nothing more, nothing less, which does lead to plenty of issues when Starlight is unable to properly communicate just what she wants them to do, which obviously causes everything to go wrong. And I also feel like the another knock with the episode is the fact that it doesn't really address a lot of the main six's concerns with Starlight, where obviously if you go back to the QD remark, it was largely Twilight's initiative to bring on Starlight as her student and really introduce this former villain into their lives without them really like getting to see some of the good side behind Starlight. And we see that throughout a lot of season 6 where they don't really accept Starlight fully, and it's largely Twilight who is socializing Starlight into being good here. And yes, while that is justified in a byproduct of the rushed nature of Starlight's redemption arc in the QD remark, I do kind of knock the episode, and that doesn't give the rest of the main 6 much of a reason to believe that Starlight's really changed, and I don't blame them for being so mad against Starlight after she resorts to mind control in order to get them to do all the tasks. Though again, the episode is able to rectify that to a degree by having Starlight clean up all the mess, and in the process, having her learn the friendship lessons without Starlight fully realizing it. So I do see the issues people have with this episode, how it calls into question whether Starlight deserved to be redeemed or not. But I personally like this episode more than most people. And yes, while I do acknowledge that some of the messiness is there, I do feel like it does enough to rectify it throughout to make it pretty enjoyable, but also pretty good in terms of setting up Starlight's redemption arc. And it's for that reason that I do have it here at number 49. Now moving on to number 48, and we have an episode very similar to Every Little Thing She Does, where I do like it, and I do like a lot of the direction that it takes the characters in, but it does still have some issues that makes it a bit messy. But here we have Too Many Pinkie Pies, and I do like this episode a lot as well. I do like the way that presents Pinkie throughout a lot of it, and that is largely what gave me the edge with this episode over Every Little Thing She Does, and that I do enjoy Pinkie as a character more than I do Starlight, but again, they're both characters I do like a lot, as evidenced by my previous videos. But anyway, we do see Pinkie really trying to spread herself thin here by creating clones of herself, with each new version becoming more flanderized than the rest. And obviously a big theme of the episode is the idea that Pinkie has complexity, that she is more than just spouting off jokes and non sequiturs, and she is a pony with a full range of emotions. And with each new version that's created, she's not only like causing chaos throughout the town, but she's entering her own identity crisis where she is questioning like whether she is truly the real Pinkie or not. And that is an interesting theme throughout a lot of it, with her like having to prove that she is capable of sitting down and remaining still, that she's willing to do whatever it takes to obviously help her friends out and ensuring that they can go back to the good times that they were having before. There is a lot of good stuff in this episode that lies underneath the surface. Though, admittedly, my biggest problem with the episode is the actual test that they use in order to prove Pinky's real identity. Where, yes, I get that the whole point of it is to show that the real Pinky is capable of concentrating and doing what she needs to in order to stand out from the rest of the crowd. But I still feel like this test is way too reckless, in my opinion, where even the real Pinky could have just cracked under the pressure, and Twilight could have just simply killed her, or I guess just send her back to the magic pool, and they never would have known that was the real Pinky. And for all they knew, that this test could have just produced another clone as the real Pinky, and they would have spent the rest of their lives thinking that they had caught out the real Pinky, while the real Pinky is probably dead or stuck in some weird purgatory. Like, I feel like they could have done more tests to try to verify that this is the real Pinky. And obviously, they didn't have to actually kill all the Pinkies either. And especially not the original clone, as it is implied that during the final two of that test, that was between the real Pinky and the original clone, who was the most similar to the real Pinky in terms of their personality. As we even saw earlier in the episode, that original clone did have a full range of emotions, that she did feel bad when she didn't spend time with everyone, and that she was still missing out. She got very emotional there. And the fact that they still sent that real Pinky back to the magic pool, or killed her, I guess, is not the best feeling in the world. Like, that Pinky could have been redeemed, and a lot of those earlier clones could have also been redeemed as well. But the fact that they resort to this test, the fact that they resort to literally using brute force in order to bring it down to one Pinky, and the fact that Twilight herself seems to get some weird kick out of just killing all these Pinky clones isn't the best look in the world. And part of the reason why this episode is a bit lower for me. And also, I just feel like they could have dedicated more time to showing the real Pinky's reaction to all this. But as it is still a very enjoyable episode for me. And yes, while the actual resolution to the conflict isn't ideal, I still find that this episode has a lot of good content in it, a lot of good Pinky content, and it's for that reason that I have it here at number 48. Now we're moving on to number 47, and these next couple episodes are pretty good and definitely have some interesting stuff within them, but sort of similar to episodes I've already talked about, they're probably not the most entertaining in the world. But number 47, we have Common Ground from season 9. And to me, the most interesting part of this episode is the fact that not only has Patton Oswalt in it, but also the fact that the daughter is voiced by his real life daughter, and that his new girlfriend is voiced by Patton Oswalt's real life second wife, which is an interesting dynamic that adds some interesting context to this episode. And on the whole, this is still a solid episode with a solid message. Seeing Quibble Pants trying really hard to impress Wind Spirit, only for her to increasingly see through his act the fact that he doesn't know anything about buckball, or really sports for that matter, and him just beating himself up over not being good at sports, and also seeing him trying and failing to show his knowledge of sports, even scoring a goal against his own team during the demonstration, which is pretty funny. But it all leads to a pretty heartwarming conclusion where, like, Clear Sky, Wind Spirit, like, they really come to see that Quibble Pants knows nothing about buckball, but is willing to learn, and is willing to just do what she wants, and that he's trying to spend time with her in that way. So I do find that pretty good. And really, this is a solid episode, and one that I do like, but I feel like other episodes definitely have more going for them, and are certainly more entertaining for me, which is a big reason I have this episode here at number 47. Now we're moving on to number 46, and we have a very similar episode to talk about, and here we have For Whom the Sweetie Belle Toils, and this is another pretty good episode, though admittedly not the most entertaining for me. I mean, it is cool seeing Sweetie Belle getting all jealous against Rarity, when it seems like people are more focused on Rarity and are increasingly more impressed by Rarity than anything that Sweetie Belle is doing. And we do see Sweetie Belle's whole plan to ruin the headpiece that Rarity had prepared for Sapphire Shoals, only for her to have this dream where she is being given this award, but then Rarity, like, is there to rain on her parade, which does lead into Luna being involved here and really teaching Sweetie Belle a lesson, but also showing that Rarity does care for her, and that the reason why it did seem like Rarity was overshadowing Sweetie Belle wasn't so much out of malice, but because Sweetie Belle was boring the kids at her birthday party, and how she was really trying to make the costumes at the play the most impressive that they could be. So it is nice seeing that misunderstanding getting cleared up. And then Sweetie Belle and the rest of the CMC spend the rest of the episode trying to go into the rehearsal to fix the headpiece before it gets exposed as being broken. And admittedly, that's probably one of the slower parts of the episode. but it still leads to a pretty nice conclusion. Sweetie Belle admits to her mistake, they fix the headdress, and it turns out to be alright. So, pretty good episode, all things considered. And I do feel like it's a bit more entertaining to watch than something like Bloom and Gloom. But admittedly, I still feel like there's some room for it to be better and some room for it to be more entertaining for me. And because of that, I do have it here at number 46. Now we're moving on to number 45, and we have another very similar episode, pretty solid, and has some good moments in it, but I feel like other episodes are simply more entertaining and have more to offer. But here we have Meltdown, and I know that I've been very hot on this episode before, and it's still a pretty good episode, with Spike spending so much of it trying to avoid like people seeing him, particularly Rarity, while he's going through this molting process. And we even see him bonding with Smolder, who really helps him understand what's happening, which does eventually culminate in him like turning into a cocoon and then coming out with his wings. And I always love that scene where he does freeze up, and for literally 10 seconds, it just shows that distant shot of his just cocoon just there, and there's no noise or anything. And then eventually he does crack out. And I always love that moment. Again, very solid episode, and sort of fits with this grouping of episodes here that are solid and have some good stuff within them, but are probably not my personal favorite. And it's for that reason that I have it here at number 45. Now we're moving on to number 44, and we are continuing with this grouping of episodes that are pretty good, but not my personal favorite. Although this one definitely has the most interesting message of the group. But here we have It Ain't Easy Being Breezy's. And this is another notable episode. It's obviously Fluttershy's key episode, and a lot of it does have her learning to be more assertive and her really forcing the Breezes to get on their way so that they can get back home in time. And that obviously leads into this interesting message about tough love and how it was really hard for Fluttershy to put her hoof down and really get these Breezes to do what was in their best interest. And I always love that moment too, where she finally forces them out. But then the minute that they all get out, she immediately breaks down crying. She feels bad for what she did, but knows deep down that it was the right thing to do. And we do see them eventually help them getting back home, even turning into Breezies in the process. So it's still a solid episode, and one that is definitely within the top half of episodes for the series, and has a very interesting message, which is a big reason that I have it at the top of this grouping. But again, it's not my personal favorite, and I feel like other episodes are more consistently entertaining and more memorable in my eyes. And it's for that reason that I have it here at number 44. Now I'm moving on to number 43, and this episode's sort of a weird case, as whenever I think of this episode, it is a pretty solid one, but whenever I don't think about it, it very quickly fades from my mind. But here we have The Chrysaling, the season 6 premiere. And admittedly, I feel like the weakest part of this episode is a lot of the Flurry Heart stuff. It does seem like Flurry Heart is there simply to create conflict and to make things worse, which again may have been the point, but it does lead to things like her destroying the crystal heart because she cries too much, her burning the book that contained the solution for how to fix the crystal heart isn't great. And we do see that Flurry Heart is there to create conflict, and it does seem a bit convenient at points that she's there to create conflict. Literally, the moment that any sort of solution comes into play, she's there to just make things more complicated. And we also get in part 2, another minor issue is that I feel like a lot of part 2 feels similar to like the Crystal Empire, where a lot of it does fall upon the rest of MA6 trying to keep the Crystal Ponies in the dark. Although this time they are a bit more transparent, and there is that scene where they do have to lead them out of the Crystal Empire without fully saying that the Crystal Heart is broken, but like whatever. So that does get a bit tedious as well. But if we're taking those elements out, this is a pretty solid two-parter. I mean, and a lot of it does hinge around Starlight here, with her like trying to find her own now that she's Twilight's student. Like we see her early on in the episode getting lost in the castle, and her walking on Spike, and that little moment where she says, "Sorry, Spike, I guess I'm still trying to find my way around," just really highlights how broken she's become and how not confident she is anymore, how unsure of herself she is at this point, between her like not knowing her way around and her questioning whether she deserves to even be a Twilight student. So I did find that interesting. She then gets to go to the Crystal Empire to try and reunite with Sunburst, but you can very tell that she's upset by the whole prospect. She's very terrified that like Sunburst is going to find out about what happened after they left. She even has a bit of a panic attack, which was pretty interesting and a very iconic moment there. She obviously tries to stall for a lot of it, and even when she does meet Sunburst, we can very tell that Sunburst is also trying to keep things secret. He's trying to hide the fact that he didn't become this great wizard that she thought that he had become ever since leaving her. And obviously that moment where he does let it out that he didn't like do so well and that he had to drop out of magic school, and how just like being able to read stuff in a book doesn't translate to him executing. It's not only a pretty impactful scene, but it obviously leads to Starlight's reaction where she dumps everything about her past. And you can very much tell that she was hurt by this as well. It makes it feel like that all the suffering she had went through by Sunburst leaving was kind of for nothing, as it sure showed that like Sunburst left her in order to go on to do these great things, only for him to not do those great things, which does make a lot of her loneliness like feel kind of in vain to a degree, and all the guilt that she feels from doing the bad stuff could have been entirely avoided. So you can kind of empathize with her over why she ends up leaking all this out and why she gets so upset upon learning that Sunburst like had all these issues ever since leaving her. So that's something. And they do end up becoming friends again after that, which is pretty good. But again, the main reason that this episode isn't higher is a lot of the Flurry Heart stuff, and plus some of the recycled elements from the Crystal Empire that makes this episode probably not as memorable as it could have been otherwise. But it's really the Starlight stuff that really elevates it to such a degree that I have it here at number 43. Now we're moving on to number 42, and we're moving on to a grouping of episodes that are all pretty solid and a bit more memorable than the last couple episodes we talked about, but they do have one or two minor issues that kind of lower my opinion of them, but they're still pretty good. And actually, a lot of them are pretty early episodes as well. But number 42, we have Griffin the Brush Off, and this is a solid episode. It definitely establishes Pinkie and Rainbow Dash's friendship. It's interesting seeing how Rainbow Dash is actually very annoyed at Pinkie, which sort of reinforces this idea that maybe the main six were not all cohesive before Twilight came along and brought them all together. And we see Pinkie really trying to befriend Rainbow, and obviously they end up bonding through their love of practical jokes and stuff like that. And obviously there's that moment where Rainbow Dash almost pulls a prank on Fluttershy, only for Pinkie to talk her out of it, which, considering what happens in 28 Pranks Later, was a pretty interesting moment there. And obviously from there we get Gilda coming along and really making Pinkie a third wheel for a lot of this. And I do like how Pinkie spends a lot of these episodes thinking that she could just be jealous, and how she basically tries to convince herself that maybe there isn't a problem with Gilda, that maybe like she is a good person deep down and that Pinkie is the one with the problem, only for her to get confirmation that Gilda is just a jerk, even making Fluttershy cry after she bumped into her. That causes her to try and expose her. Now, that does lead into the main issue with the episode, is that a lot of the party scene does feel a bit mean-spirited, where it does feel like Gilda is trying her best to put on a good face here and not be too rude, but then it feels like she's just being pushed and pushed more so by Pinkie, only for her to eventually snap. And it turns out that Rainbow was actually the one to put all the pranks there, which obviously leads to Rainbow being pretty upset at Gilda and her not being friends anymore. So I did find that a bit mean-spirited, where it did feel like Gilda was being pushed over the edge, and it was really like that whole setup that made her feel trapped in a way. So I did feel like that was a bit of an issue that knocks the episode to a degree, but this is still a very solid episode of the series and definitely one of the more enjoyable ones, but still that minor issue that keeps it off from being higher, and it is here at number 42. Now we're moving on to number 41, and we have a very similar episode to get into here, but here we have The Last Roundup, and this is another pretty good episode. Now, admittedly, there are more flaws with this episode than Griffin the Brush Off. Like, there's obviously the whole opening scene with Derpy destroying the town hall, which basically makes this episode have a bit of stakes here, with Applejack feeling like she has to win the contest in order to raise money to rebuild the city hall that Derpy destroyed, which obviously isn't ideal. And then the very end of the episode, which has this strange gag of the main six not picking up Pinkie and Rarity, leaving them to have to go back to Ponyville all by themselves. And the episode does try to give them some fault for this, with Pinkie deciding to jump off the Applejack's wagon after talking to her, knocking off Rarity in the process, and then Rainbow Dash saying that they basically brought it upon themselves, which, considering that immediately afterwards, we do see their reconciliation with Applejack and how they made such a big deal about how friends are there for each other and there to support each other. The fact that they don't go back for Pinkie and Rarity does leave a bit of a weird taste in my mouth. I actually wrote a fanfic about it at the time, which was pretty funny, but also sort of undercuts the message there. So this episode definitely has more issues going on with it, and I know people have also poked at the fact that Applejack was overreacting, how the fact that she still did pretty well at the tournament, but just not good enough to win the grand prize is a pretty strange excuse for her not going back to Ponyville over that, which obviously leads into this whole mystery. So I know some people are a bit underwhelmed by that and feel like it was a bit of an overreaction there. But this is still a solid episode. It's interesting seeing Applejack trying to hide like the truth for a lot of it. It's also interesting seeing how she basically exposes a loophole in the Pinky promise she made with Pinky, to where she said she would say everything at breakfast, but then because she runs out before they can go to breakfast, she was never there for breakfast to begin with, and therefore she didn't actually break the Pinky promise. That was sort of a creative thing there. And obviously the whole like scene at the end, taking out the fact that they basically ditched Pinky and Rarity, is still a pretty heartfelt moment where even Rainbow Dash is getting all mushy. So there's all that to consider. And this is a good episode, but definitely not the best, and it is held back by those issues. And because of that, it is here at number 41. Now moving on to number 40, and we have a very similar episode to get into here. Mostly good, but has one main issue with it. And here we have Luna Eclipsed, another season 2 episode. And for me, the main problem with the episode is, I guess, sort of the mean-spiritedness for a lot of it, where, yeah, it is explained later on that Pinky was just like acting scared to fit with the holiday, and just in general, like obviously bringing a lot of the Phillies along with her. But still, I feel like they could have explained that better, and that does lead to a lot of this episode feeling contrived in some ways, where it feels like Pinky is perpetuating the conflict for a lot of it, with her literally getting in the way of Luna's efforts to assimilate and to really fit in. But as for the positives, there are plenty of good things about this episode. I do like how Luna is this mostly eccentric figure, someone who is very much a product of her time, and her just trying to adapt to the modern era is pretty amusing. That does lead to some plenty of funny moments there. Obviously, her saying that the fun is doubled is a pretty iconic line, and then her basically having this big outburst afterwards, with her basically canceling Nightmare Night forever is a pretty good moment there. That does lead into her getting pretty upset. That does lead to Twilight, like, comforting her and her letting her know that it's all in good fun. And again, that is explained, but I feel like it could have been conveyed more within the episode. But as it is, it just feels like something that led to the conflict going on a bit longer than it probably should have. But on the whole, this is still a solid episode. Definitely one of the more memorable episodes from the early seasons of the show. But that main knock is what keeps it down here at number 40. Now we're moving on to number 39, and we are sticking with this grouping of episodes that are good but not perfect. And here we have Castle Sweet Castle. And this is an episode where I do appreciate the concept of it, where it takes a relatively small moment from a previous episode and blows it up and tries to make it a more serious story. In this case, we do see that here, with the fact that Golden Oaks was destroyed and Twilight had to get a new home because of it. And now Twilight has to look back on that and her feeling like the new castle isn't home and that she misses Golden Oaks, and she misses the fact that Golden Oaks is no longer there because Tyrek destroyed it. And I do appreciate that. I am glad that they are taking the time to make a story like this. And for the most part, I feel like it's pretty well executed, particularly with a lot of Twilight and Spike going about their day, with Spike distracting Twilight and taking her out of the castle so that the rest of the main six can decorate it. And we do have that nice moment as well where they walk by the remains of Golden Oaks and they get to reminisce about it to a degree, which is a pretty nice moment. As for the main story, I do like the song. It has a very catchy song about making this castle a home. And I do appreciate the concept as well of each of the main six bringing in what they think Twilight will like, which is more so a projection of how they would decorate the castle if they were the owners of it, which does lead into the main conflict of the episode. But with that said, I feel like that's sort of the main problem I have with it as well, where the rest of the main six probably should not have needed to learn this lesson, and they probably should have recognized from very early on just how big of a mess they make things by bringing in all these supplies. And I feel like it probably should have come out more in the discussions before they brought in any decorations. The fact that they just go off on their own and bringing all these decorations, yes, while it is happening during a pretty nice song, it still is a bit of an issue I have with the episode. And just in general, while I do like this episode and appreciate the concept that I was going for, I feel like other episodes we'll be talking about soon are better in execution and have fewer issues than I have with this episode. So, with all that, I do feel like it is a decent episode, a definitely entertaining one, but one that's not free of issues. And because of that, it is here number 39. Now, moving on to number 38, and we have the highest episode in this grouping here. And while I wouldn't say this episode has as many flaws as the last couple of episodes we talked about, I do have some disagreements with the decisions that they made that do make it probably not as effective as it probably could have, but that's just me. But at number 38, we do have The Last Problem, the series finale of the series. And I do have some disagreements with this episode. I don't like how they treat a lot of the coronation as this joke, as a lot of it just seems to be there to subvert expectations, where we saw back in Magical Mystery Cure that Twilight's ascension to be an alicorn was treated with a lot of gravitas there, and just in general, we saw plenty of bigger moments here as well. So for this episode to literally treat like Twilight's biggest accomplishment in her life to be treated as a joke, and for a lot of it to be perpetuated by her own fault, where she basically threw a massive hissy fit right before leaving for the coronation, that distracted the rest of the main six from doing their preparations that they were working so hard on, was a pretty weird way of going about things, where they were definitely trying to make this a big emotional moment, but also trying to deconstruct it in some ways by showing how Twilight's emotions, while well-founded, do lead to this big moment where everything goes wrong because they couldn't prepare everything accordingly. And I don't know, I just don't feel like it worked as well as it could have. And that entire scene just is kind of boring, if you ask me. Sort of weird seeing how everything is going wrong here. But again, I can at least appreciate like that afterwards we do see them laughing about it, how it didn't tear apart their friendship like Lesser Dawn thought it would. And, like you could take it or leave it. But aside from that, this episode is pretty solid. It does largely what it needs to in terms of wrapping up the series by showing how the main six can still be friends, even if they are going their separate ways, with Pinky having to do all the banquets from now on, and Rarity being more focused on her franchise and stuff like that. There are plenty of interesting stuff going on here, and plus plenty of nice ways of tying up loose ends, like we see Lyra and Bonbon did get married. We do see Rainbow and Applejack having this weird, ambiguous, but heavily implied romance going on there. We also see Pinky and Cheese getting married, which is pretty nice as well. And just seeing like the follow-up to each of these characters now that they're much older is pretty nice. Like you have them being noticeably older, which does have a tinge of sadness to it in the sense that we do see that Twilight's probably going to outlive a lot of them, which isn't great. We have Spike growing up, being much bigger now, and him being the royal advisor still, which does lead to Lesser John making plenty of jokes where she doesn't seem to recognize it, and Spike just overreacting to everything is pretty humorous as well. And admittedly, I do feel like a lot of it is being propped up by the fact that it's the final episode, and the fact that it does have all these things that it needs to accomplish just handed on its plate. And while I do have some disagreements with the way it executes some of those things, I still find this an enjoyable episode, and that entire ending sequence, like seeing the final song, The Magic of Friendship Grows, is a pretty impactful one, and one that does have plenty of good moments in it, a lot of good visuals in it, particularly during that final chorus. And admittedly, that final shot of them looking off in the sunset is very overused, and I actually really went out of my way to use a different screenshot for there, but it's still a nice visual, and obviously it leads to the bookend of the book closing as we zoom out, sort of a callback to the very first episode. So this is a very nice and satisfying conclusion to the series, although one that I do have some disagreements with, and admittedly, I feel like other episodes are more entertaining than it, but still a solid enough episode to where I have it here at number 38. Now moving on to number 37, and these next couple episodes are pretty good, and they don't have as many issues, or at least not as many blatant issues as other episodes. Although, admittedly, I feel like a lot of their appeal and a lot of the reason they get brought up are because of their world building elements, or at least those are the most impressive elements to those episodes that do keep them a bit lower in my view. By number 37, we do have the episode that has the most flaws in this group, but still a pretty notable one. And here we have Princess Twilight Sparkle, the season 4 premiere. And my biggest issue with this episode is the conclusion, or at least the conclusion of how like this all started, where it turns out that all the vines were caused by Discord planting these seeds way back when Celestia and Luna were confronting him, and it just felt very anticlimactic. I felt like they definitely could have given it a bit more gravitas, although given the fact that the vines themselves were not given the same level of, I guess, gravitas compared to other villains that we see from other two-parters, it kind of makes sense. Though considering that this was the main conflict of the episode, I did feel like it was a bit underwhelming in that regard. But to the episode's credit, I still feel like it's a very solid one for the most part. We get plenty of flashbacks showing like the time when Celestia and Luna were still together, and we obviously get that big scene of Celestia banishing Luna to the moon after she gets corrupted, which is a very emotional scene, of course. We see Twilight's reaction to it and her taking a very long time to realize that it's actually a flashback versus something that's happening in the present. So take that as you will. Still a major highlight from the episode. And we do see Twilight doing her best to adjust to her new role as princess, with her literally feeling like she has to like learn to fly, and then later on with the rest of the main six trying to protect her, and them trying to exclude her from their adventures while they're going off to try and find the Tree of Harmony. Like there's plenty of like interesting stuff there with Twilight's adjustment to her new circumstances in life. And just in general, this is a solid episode. But I feel like the lack of a strong villain, considering the fact that this is the first big two-parter after Twilight gets her wings, is a bit of a disappointment for me. And it's for that reason that I have it here at number 37. Now we're moving on to number 36, and we have another episode that's kind of similar to it. A lot of it does involve world building, although there's still some other things going on in there. But here we have the lost treasure of Griffinstone, and obviously this is Gilda's redemption arc in this episode, with her being reintroduced, with Rainbow Dash not being super happy to see her, although Pinkie seems pretty quick to forgive Gilda, which is a bit of a weird thing going on there, considering much of Gilda's animosity from Griffin the Brush-Off was directed at Pinkie, and it was more so Rainbow Dash who was disillusioned, which was sort of a weird thing there. But obviously the whole point was to show how Pinkie was a good spirit and how she was more quick to forgive than anything else. But a lot of this episode really shows Griffin's society and how much in destitute it really is, with it being broken and no one really like cooperating, them not really having much of a culture, which is pretty depressing. We get that scene of Grandpa Gruff giving the story about how the lost treasure got lost, and then Pinkie's reaction afterwards with her crying and saying, "That was the saddest story ever," which is pretty funny. And then seeing them trying to recover this lost treasure, thinking that will somehow restore the former glory of Griffinstone, only for them to not really get it by the end of it, with Rainbow Dash like having to give it up in order to be rescued after they get trapped in the gorge. And along the way, we get Gilda's redemption arc, with us having this backstory showing how she was pretty lonely when she was sent to flight school, but then Rainbow Dash was one of her few friends, which really should have been more of a knock against Griffin the Brush-Off, in that it really shows Pinkie as really driving this wedge and really costing Gilda her only friend. Though to be fair, Gilda wasn't the most pleasant person in the world either. And really, this episode really showed a lot of the reasons why, with her being raised in a culture that didn't really value friendship or like working together as much. And we do see by the end that Rainbow Dash and Pinkie are able to help Gilda, making small steps towards restoring Griffinstone, which isn't through restoring the treasure or anything, but just by promoting the ideas of friendship and Gilda making those tiny steps. And yes, while future episodes indicate that she hasn't made that much progress there, that there's still a lot of misery going on in Griffinstone, it's still a nice enough conclusion to the story that makes it pretty satisfying, all things considered. So really, when I think of this episode, I feel like it's one that is largely there like for world building, not only for establishing Griffinstone as Griffin society, but also by giving us Gilda's backstory that does lead into her redemption arc. But still, if I'm being honest, this isn't the most entertaining episode either. It's just a very solid one for me. And while it has some moments that make it stand out compared to other episodes we talked about not too long ago, I feel like 36 is about as high as I can put it. Now we're moving on to number 35, and we have another largely similar episode, and one that really comes to mind when I think of world building for the series. But here we have Gauntlet of Fire from season 6. And this episode is largely here to establish more dragon culture and really seeing it in a more positive light. We obviously get introduced to Ember in this episode, and she does have a bit of a growth arc in this episode, which is pretty interesting to see, with her starting to open up to Spike as the episode goes along, and with Spike agreeing to help her like pursue the quest to become the Dragon Lord. So all that's pretty good. And really, this is just a all-around solid episode with Spike and Ember working together, becoming friends along the way, and ultimately stopping Garble, who wanted to become Dragon Lord so that he could invade Equestria. And yeah, they gave this guy a redemption arc after that, but whatever. It's really a solid episode for me, and a big reason that it is this high on the list. But admittedly, I feel like other episodes are more entertaining for me, and because of that, I do have it here at number 35. Now we're moving on to number 34, and this episode literally exists as world building, but still very solid for me. And here we have the Cutie Mark Chronicles. And obviously, this is a very basic story, with it basically just showing the backstory for each of the main six, showing how each of them got their cutie marks, all while wrapping them up in this destiny element where they were all forged together by the sonic rain boom, how they all got their cutie marks at the same time, which does sort of imply that they do have this rendezvous with destiny that allowed them to get together, which is all pretty solid. I do like each of the stories as well, showing how they each went off about different paths towards getting their cutie marks, and there's plenty of subtext there as well, like Applejack thinking that she was better cut out for the city and moving to Manhattan only to be pretty homesick there and moving back and getting her cutie mark that way. You obviously have Pinky like being shown on the rock farm and her being very unhappy there until the rain boom inspired her to create a party in order to keep the happiness going. And obviously that made a lot of her family very happy when she threw her first party. So there's obviously that to consider. You have Fluttershy and her entire thing of falling out of the sky only to be rescued by animals, and then her singing a song about how there are so many wonders, and her just sounding like Pinky the whole time as she's singing, which is pretty humorous there. You obviously have Twilight, who is trying to take the test to get admitted into the school, and she has to hatch Spike in order to do so, and she was about to fail the test until the rain boom made her rattled so that she spout off all this magic, and Celestia was walking by, and that caused her to see her potential there. So there's that. And we even get some clarification in this episode that Rarity's cutie mark isn't even about fashion, it's about identifying gems, which she's able to finesse into a career about fashion, where she's obviously going around collecting gems to put onto her various creations, which is very interesting as well. And then obviously there's Rainbow Dash, who's really the one who brings it all together, with her going on this race to restore Fluttershy's honor, and in doing so creates the Sonic Rain Boom. And obviously this gets referenced back in future episodes for obvious reasons. And just seeing this realization at the end is all very heartwarming as well, where they all like see how they were all bonded get together, only for Scootaloo to have a pretty funny reaction there. And just in general, I do like how this episode is framed as well, where we see the CMC spending this entire episode trying to look for Rainbow Dash, but then along the way they end up bumping into the rest of the main six. And on through that, they end up sharing their stories, thinking that they're going to help them out there, only to meet Rainbow Dash by the end. And it was pretty clear that the rest of the main six told Rainbow that the CMC were looking for her specifically for a cutie mark story, which is pretty interesting there. All around, this is a very fun episode, very solid episode, a lot of entertaining moments to have there. And of course, this is a pretty important episode for building each of the backstories for each of the characters there. And just in general, a very fun episode. But again, I feel like it sort of fits in this tier of episodes that are largely there for world building, as literally this episode's main purpose is to world build and to give all these backstories. So while I can't have it any higher than here, I still enjoy this episode a lot, and because of that, it is here at number 34. Now we're moving on to number 33, and we are starting to move away from this grouping of world building episodes. But at number 33, we still have a mostly solid episode, although I actually believe it has dropped since I talked about it in the past, but whatever. But at number 33, we actually have the season 2 premiere, The Return of Harmony. And this one's actually a bit lower compared to other two-parters, as I originally had it number 3 on my two-parter ranking, though obviously now it has technically dropped a spot. It is still a very solid episode, a lot of good stuff there, like seeing all the scenes of Discord corrupting each of the main six, particularly that Pinky scene where Discord is really able to feed into her insecurity about being laughed at versus laughing with others, and then just all the balloons laughing at her suffering and everything that leads to her becoming pretty bitter, and just in general, Discord's whole scheme of corrupting each of the main six by really capitalizing on the flaws of their respective elements, taking them to their logical conclusions and showing how each of them respective virtues can be flaws in a lot of ways. So that was pretty interesting. And just a lot of part one is just seeing all these trials being played out. And then in part two, we basically had Twilight not really knowing that each of them got corrupted and her thinking that they were still going about their business, even though like stuff was clearly wrong, which does eventually lead to her realization that all her friends have become complete jerks and that she wants to just get it over with so that she never has to deal with them again. But then it obviously fails because one, Rainbow Dash ran off, but also like they obviously don't embody their elements, which obviously leads to Twilight losing hope and her kind of becoming corrupted. But then they're able to turn things around by like realizing that something was wrong with them, and then like they're able to basically get everyone back together, basically uncorrupt them, and then they defeat Discord. So it's still a very solid episode, very solid story from beginning to end. Although I will admit that upon further like examination, I feel like it's not as entertaining as other two-parters. I feel like the top three two-parters all have more going on within them than this one. As I've always said that I've never been a massive Discord fan, and I feel like with this episode, with its focusing so much on Discord, I mean, yes, he is supposed to be the villain, and how a lot of the joke there is that he's supposed to be so random by creating all this chaos, but even then, the chaos itself isn't that interesting. A lot of it feels like your typical 2011 random humor style of things that doesn't really age super well, but personally, that's my own preference. So while it's still a very solid episode, I can't really justify it as having it as one of my favorites of the series. And it's for that reason that I do have it here at number 33. Now we're moving on to number 32, and I really considered putting this episode higher on the list as it's very enjoyable for me and has a lot of great moments within it. However, after thinking about some more, I sort of decided to leave it down here simply because I feel like it doesn't have anything that makes it exceptionally great that would cause it to be significantly higher on the list, but I still do enjoy this episode a lot. But here we have Marks for Effort from season 8, aka Cozy Glow's introduction episode. And this is a very consistent episode, I would say, where a lot of it has some good humor in it, like all of the CMC's like ploys to get admitted into the friendship school, like Apple Bloom not doing her chores, and Sweetie Belle's whole scheme to put on a play where they stage this big fight. And obviously that leads to like this really bad acting job by each of them. But for whatever reason, Fluttershy and Pinkie seem to believe it for a lot of it, where they do seem like they're saying stuff like, it's almost like they forgot their friends. Really, that whole scene feels like it was staged, like almost as if like Fluttershy and Pinkie didn't actually believe it and that they were just playing along. But it almost does feel like they believe it, which is even more hilarious. And obviously, they end up screwing at the plan because they end up getting too excited by how much it was working. So obviously there's that. And then we get to Cozy Glow's introduction, which does come a bit out of nowhere. She does just sort of appear out of the blue. And you can tell from very early on that she's supposed to be this twist villain, which I do kind of knock against the episode, where you are supposed to almost believe that Cozy Glow is supposed to be this good person, but the foreshadowing is clearly there. I mean, you have her whole accent, like how she like turns her R's into W's, like, which was a very clearly a fake voice, as she seems to talk normally when she isn't crying, but the moment the tears come about, that's when she starts to do that, and that's obvious that it's just an act. You obviously have that scene as well when she's studying for the test, and she has these weird moments like when she sees the element of magic and thinks that stands for control. Again, very much a Freudian slip there. And then like when she's mastering the flashcard, she ends up getting the element of magic stuck in her pupils, which again is very good foreshadowing there. And she has a pretty sinister look as well, which is additional foreshadowing. You have her whole scheme of failing the test on purpose just to make the CMC look bad. And yeah, while she does go to Starlight's office afterward and admits that it was this devious scheme, it's still a very weird idea in the first place that does lead to the CMC getting into trouble. That whole moment of like Twilight summoning them to their office, and then Scootaloo's like, I know we want to be invited inside, but this isn't quite what I had in mind, is pretty humorous as well, with even Twilight afterwards pointing out some stuff like the fact that Cozy Glow said your mom is one of the test answers, clearly failing it on purpose, which again is another sign that Cozy Glow probably isn't that great. We also have the scene where Cozy Glow goes to Starlight's office, and the whole joke throughout a lot of the episode is that Starlight's just really excited to have even one student come into her office, and she knows how there isn't really much of a need for a guidance counselor at a school for friendship. And then like she gets overeager to help out, and she has these plenty of funny moments there, like her offering Coco, like with her like wondering if Cozy Glow heard her talking to herself. And then obviously the very classic moment of her saying, "Sounds devious. I mean, I see." Again, very funny moment there. So, really, this episode is very entertaining from beginning to end. And sort of weird because you think of this episode as is very important episode for the story, where it does introduce Cozy Glow and it does start to lay the seeds of her being a villain, though it doesn't really double down until What Lies Beneath, but we'll get into that episode soon. But the weird thing is, I actually like this episode because of the comedy. Like, there's a lot of really funny moments there. And admittedly, some of them are a bit ironic in my view, where some of it just stems from the weird things that I find funny versus anything that was overly intentional on this episode's part. But still a solid episode in that regard. But again, I feel like there's more episodes that do more for me. And while this is a very solid episode, I feel like it's lacking something that would cause it to be at the very top of the list. So because of that, I can't really have it too much higher than here, but still a very good episode. And it's here at number 32. Now we're moving on to number 31, and sort of in line with Marks for Effort, I feel like these next two episodes mainly stand out for their comedy, but also just being pretty lighthearted in general. And while that's pretty great for them in terms of them being this high on the list, I feel like it's not really enough to justify them being higher here. But at number 31, we have the Saddle Row Review, and obviously a big factor for this episode is the presentation, where sort of similar to the Big Mac question, it is sort of presented as this documentary where we have lots of confessionals. A lot of the characters are sort of recounting what happened, and that leads to some pretty funny moments, like the part where Pinky takes a big bite of the pancakes, which reveals that one of the clones like got away and is still alive, which is pretty humorous. There's a lot of good comedy here as well, like with Twilight in her sweeping song. You have Pinky wanting to go upstairs to keep the noise down, but her sort of giving in to her temptations and her having like a good angel and a bad angel on each of her shoulder, which is pretty good. You have Verity being pressured to hire the landlord's daughter as well. So there's a lot of good shenanigans here. And again, I feel like it is propped up by the entertainment in the presentation here. I don't really have anything bad to say about this episode, but I feel like sort of similar to Marks for Effort, there also isn't too much to make it too much higher than here. And I feel like a lot of it is being propped up by its presentation more so than anything else, which is a big reason that I have it here at number 31. Now we're moving on to number 30, and we have a very similar episode to the Saddle Row Review. A lot of it feels very lighthearted, and a lot of it's pretty entertaining because of that. Though again, I feel like there isn't too much to prop it up beyond that. But here we have Discordant Harmony. And I do like this episode as well. I do like a lot of the premise here where Discord is getting pretty self-conscious over how weird he is and how he's prone to not being the most likable character in the world, which does prompt him to try to make himself as much of a normie as possible in order to impress Fluttershy, or at least not completely offend her when she wants to go over his house. And there's a lot of good shenanigans when he's trying to get the house ready, like him going to the store and running to Pinky, and then Pinky saying that because he knows him so well, that like he'll be able to just appeal to her at every opportunity. And then there's obviously Pinky's like whole thing afterwards about her saying if the store has any flying napkins, and the fact that she just yells it is pretty humorous to me as well. Obviously Discord like cloning himself in order to make the house ready and make it like not have stairs that lead to nowhere, which is pretty funny as well. You have him dressing up as basically this Mr. Rogers figure while Fluttershy goes over, and she gets pretty easily like weirded out by it. She feels like it's pretty awkward. And then we get to the climax of the episode where Discord starts to die because he's not doing anything random, and it's such this big calamity because he's not doing anything random. And it basically leads to this whole sequence of him learning to let go again. And we even see Fluttershy letting go as well, which is pretty interesting and also pretty endearing as well. And it does lead to this nice message at the end where Discord learns to accept himself, and that Fluttershy accepts him for who he is more so than anything else. And admittedly, Discord probably should have recognized this from earlier on in the series, but again, for what it is, this is a still solid episode. Plenty of lighthearted moments, and I do love the ending where the two of them are just embracing the chaos in order to prevent Discord from literally dying. And I do find that whole justification for why he is the way he is to be pretty funny as well. But again, I feel like there isn't something that makes it a top tier episode. I feel like despite being very solid, that there isn't too much to really give it that extra boost for me. And that is a big reason that I have it here at number 30. Now we're moving on to number 29. And I actually wanted to put this episode higher. And actually, when I talked about this one in my season episode ranking, I actually did have it higher. But again, it did drop largely due to other episodes going up. But here we have the main attraction. And I know there are people who consider this one of the best episodes in the series. And to be fair, this is a very entertaining episode and it has a very good foundation. I mean, you have Rara, who's a very likable character, admittedly not an overly interesting one, but I do like how even after she became a celebrity, she still cares for her fans, she cares for the children. And it's really through to Sven just being a massive jerk that causes her to come off as someone who's hard to approach. And obviously, that sort of like irks Applejack for a lot of it, where it only takes her like getting close to Rah and not being filtered by all the stuff that Sven is doing that allows her to see that deep down Rah still is the same likable, humble pony that she knew her as a filly. But it's just through Sven influence and Rah really believing that Sven is doing what's in her best interest that makes her come off as a bit standoffish at points. It's obviously only at the end when they're able to expose Fingala for being a jerk to everyone, but particularly Pinky. I mean, he really has something against Pinky for whatever reason, but whatever. That causes Rara to fire Fingala and for her to like really embrace herself. Now, there's obviously that moment right before the concert where she realizes that Fingala did do some good things, like making sure that all the logistics were ready. And it only took Applejack telling her that she needed to not like be so worried about all the technical stuff that caused her to basically change her plan and really put on this simple costume and for her to have this very simple display for a lot of it that causes her to truly embrace herself. And then we get to the song, which is very solid in my opinion. Now, granted, it does sort of fall into a similar trap as All Fly, in that the song itself comes off as a bit derivative, again, sort of based off Let It Go from Frozen. And I did say, even at the time of the season episode ranking, that I was a bit like irritated by like some of the visuals during the song. I wasn't a huge fan of them. And the fact that a lot of the unicorns were letting up their horns during the song, like as if it's like lighters from an actual concert. I mean, that was more of a pet peeve than anything else, but I thought it was something to mention. And the other song, Equestria to Land, that I love is also very good. Again, I like how they sing it both at the beginning and the end, which is pretty good. Really, this is a very enjoyable episode. It definitely feels like a big event by having this big celebrity guest star. And admittedly, Lena Hall isn't the biggest celebrity in the world, but she was pretty notable due to her Tony speech back in 2014, so at least there's that. And the episode really does make it feel like a special event. But again, I feel like that's just kind of it. I feel like it doesn't have anything that makes it truly elevated beyond this point. I feel like at the end of the day, this is a very basic story of be yourself and like people like Aurora coming around to just realizing that she doesn't need all these fancy sets and this like big producer like being elitist and everything to really just be yourself and to express herself and show the world what she's made of. It's a very simple story, and yes, while it is executed very well, I feel like compared to the episodes we'll be talking about soon, I feel like it's not really enough to make it this top tier episode for me. And because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 29. Now we're moving on to number 28, and this episode did drop a little bit. I actually had it at number 1 of its respective season episode ranking at the time, but after thinking about it a little more, I did decide to bump it down just a little bit. But here we have Sleepless in Ponyville, and obviously this is the highest ranked CMC Luna episode. And to me, this episode definitely has a lot of the same issues that I have with the other CMC Luna episodes, where it's definitely a good episode and definitely has a solid foundation behind it. But really, when I thought about it more, it just doesn't have that extra factor to me. I mean, yeah, it's pretty cool seeing Scootaloo like being worried about disappointing Rainbow, like really scared of coming off as a scaredy pony, but then like admitting to it at the end after she put her life in danger, and then having to open up to Rainbow Dash about her relationship and how she wants Rainbow Dash to be her mentor basically. And then in turn, Rainbow Dash accepts that, which is all very solid and it's all very nice. But when we're comparing it to the best of the best, I just don't feel like it adds up quite to that degree. It And even compared to the one episode left from season 3 that we have left to talk about, I just feel like there just isn't as much intrigue behind it as that episode. So because of that, I did leave it here at number 28. Now we're moving on to number 27, and we have a pretty early episode to get into here. And here we have Suited for Success, and this is another pretty solid episode. I don't really have that many complaints about it. I mean, it's a pretty interesting story, really highlighting Rarity's character and really showing just how much she is a artist when it comes to her sense of fashion, very much more than she is a consumer of fashion, which does lead to her wanting to make her friends look as good as they can. But obviously, we see the rest of the main six like trying to impose their own visions when they don't really have an eye for fashion the same way Rarity does. That does lead to a lot of their outfits being pretty ridiculous. And then obviously, Rarity does take a bit of a hit when she's the one credited for creating these ridiculous outfits. And from that, we get a pretty funny scene of her wallowing in her own self pity. She eats some ice cream. She passes out on the couch. She even considers running away. And even in that scene where she's considering it, like you can see how she's like fretting over the details, really showing how much she is putting on an act more so than anything else. The song is pretty good as well. This is just a very all around good episode for me. But again, I feel like compared to other episodes we'll be talking about soon, it doesn't quite add up for me. And because of that, it is here at number 27. Now moving on to number 26, and I did consider putting this episode higher as it's really good. It has a really solid message, also has a really good song in it. But after thinking about some more, I did feel like it was held back by some pacing issues that does cause it to fall here. But here we have Sounds of Silence, which I always end up confusing for a Kieran Tale, as that sounded like a more fitting title, but again, that's just the name of the song. This is a really good episode. It has a really interesting message as well about how it's important to be angry sometime and how you can't always like let the fear of anger or upsetting others get in the way of truly expressing yourself, which is a much better like message compared to the rest of the series. And it's sort of similar to All Bottled Up in a lot of ways. And we do see the way in which the Kieran go about it to the point where they're literally willing to silence themselves along the way. But the main reason that I don't have this episode higher is the pacing. I feel like there's a bit of big pacing issue at the beginning where all the big stuff that I imagine when I think of this episode, like the song and all the stuff with the Kieran, that all happens like towards the back half of the episode. We have a lot of stuff early on about Fluttershy and Applejack just getting to the village, and it's pretty slow, particularly like there's that whole montage of Applejack literally going all this way all by herself, but then she realizes she forgot something, so she has to go all the way back to find Fluttershy, who had never really gone along, which is kind of dumb. So those are some minor things that do hold this episode back for me. And plus, I feel like we could have gone a bit more from the other side, where a lot of it does focus on Applejack bonding with Autumn Blaze and getting her side of the story. And then when they go back, they are immediately confronted by Fluttershy, who just got the Kieran side of the story from off screen, which was a bit disappointing. But as it is, this is still a very solid episode, and definitely one of my favorites. But I feel like those technical issues hold it back to a degree. And because of that, I do have it here at number 26. Now we're moving on to number 25. And believe it or not, we actually have the highest ranked season 3 episode left on the board, which I think kind of says a lot about season 3, but that's just me. But here we have Keep Calm and Flutter On. And I did decide to bump this one up, mainly because I feel like there's a lot of interesting stuff going on between Discord and Fluttershy, with Fluttershy really trying to give Discord a chance here, while the rest of the main six outright distrust him. And it's also pretty interesting how Discord is basically trying to use a lot of the principles regarding the main six in order to keep giving him more and more chances, with him saying that they're all about friendship and how this was a part of a redemption mission, and therefore they can't be too mean about him because they're giving him a chance and they're trying to teach him about friendship, and he's really trying to manipulate Fluttershy during a lot of this to keep it on going and keep giving him more chances. And I do find that aspect of it to be very interesting in my view. But the main reason that I did bump this episode down compared to the rest of the episodes we'll be talking about is one, I feel like the premise wasn't super well explained. I mean, I know that's been compared a lot to fan fiction, where Celestia and Luna just seemingly decide out of the blue that Discord should be redeemed simply because he's powerful and could be used for good one day. So I felt like they could have done a better excuse for this story to exist in the first place. So I feel like the episode doesn't justify its existence as well as I would like. But also, I feel like the ending's a bit rushed, where Fluttershy eventually gets fed up with him and basically declares that she's not his friend. And then for half a second, Discord seems to buy into this, but then almost immediately afterwards, he regrets it and he says, "Well played, Fluttershy." Like, I felt like that was a bit rushed and could have been paced a little better there. So there are some minor issues with this episode that keep it from being higher, but I still love it. It's still a fantastic episode. And I still feel like it's a good episode for it being in season 3, which at this point doesn't have too great of a selection there, partially because of it being a shorter season, but also due to the fact that there's some pretty bad episodes in there. But ultimately, it is still the highest ranked season 3 episode for me, and because of that, it is here at number 25. Now we're moving on to number 24, and we have an episode that I did bump down from the last time that I talked about it, simply because I feel like I have a personal preference over the episode that I put it above. But here we have the best night ever, the season 1 finale. And again, I did have this one at number 1 of my season 1 ranking at the time. The main reason I bumped it down is I just feel like my personal connection to this episode isn't as strong as some of the episodes we'll be talking about soon. And on the face of it, it is more or less an event episode. It is all about culminating this arc across season 1 of them getting ready for the Grand Galloping Gala, and then just bouncing back and forth between like the main 6, like coming in with these expectations over what the gala is, only for those expectations to not be met. And there's plenty of fun to be had here. You had Fluttershy trying to bond with all the animals, only for them to be terrified by her, which does eventually lead to her saying that they will love her, which is pretty hilarious. You have all the stuff with Rarity trying to get with Blue Blood, only for Blue Blood to be a complete jerk, and for that to all culminate with him pushing her in the way of the cake flying, and then her getting fed up with him, her whole rant against him, and her trying to get him dirty with cake is also pretty funny. You have Twilight really wanting to like have fun, but feeling it gets getting pretty boring by just entertaining all the guests. You have Pinky trying to liven up the party, only for like it just to be pretty stuffy and not really her vibe, until she eventually just gets everyone into the spirit, but ends up making a mess in the process. Really, Applejack's one of the few boring examples where she's just trying to sell all her apples, but obviously because it's a high class, high society event, they don't really take much interest in her carnival food per se. And then you have Rainbow Dash just trying to impress the Wonderbolts, which honestly could have been more entertaining, like, but there's still some fun moments there, like with Soaring dropping his pie and then Rainbow Dash saving it. So there's plenty of fun to be had with this episode, seeing all these different stories come into play. You obviously have Spike as well, being pretty disappointed and him just trying to get drunk off the donuts. And then you have Celestia, who, despite inviting them to the gala and despite her seeming like she'd be disappointed when everything gets blown up at the end, she is pretty glad that the main 6 made the gala as exciting as it was and how it's always boring, and she's glad that they were there to make it worth it. So on the whole, this is your pretty standard fun episode. Pretty good way to wrap up the season 1 story arc of the gala, and there's plenty of fun to be had here. But again, I just feel like my personal connection to this episode, while it is pretty good, I feel like it sort of pales compared to some of the episodes that we talk about soon. And with it being more of an event episode, I can't really have it too much higher than here, but still a very solid episode. And because of that, I have it here at number 24. Now we're moving on to number 23, and this episode did kind of move up, or at least in relation to one list, but actually on its season episode ranking, I believe it's remaining around the same spot. But we actually have the season 5 premiere, the Cutie Map, and I did bump it above the Return of Harmony, as really the more that I think about it, this is kind of a pretty solid episode, where my biggest complaint with it for a while was how Starlight was exposed as his hypocrite and how she didn't actually like get rid of her own cutie mark, but was simply disguising it, and how she got very power hungry and hypocritical when she was confronted about it. I feel like they could have handled that scene better, where she could have like been apologetic about it, maybe been a bit ashamed of the fact that she has had to resort to this in order to like get rid of the cutie marks. But maybe she could have tried to promise that once all the cutie marks were gone, that she would get rid of her own. But obviously, that would still fail at the end of the day. So that was more so of a nitpick for me. And really, I think if we're taking all this in the context of what we know about Starlight from later on, it kind of fits that Starlight would want to be this power hungry, that she probably wouldn't want to get rid of her own cutie mark, especially when she doesn't have any practical means of like ensuring that the cutie marks could be removed otherwise. So I think at this point, I don't have as big of an issue with that aspect to it as I did before, but again, it's still something to bring up. But really, this is an all around solid episode. I mean, obviously, they go to the village, they get introduced to Starlight and her way of life. They get introduced to all these towns ponies that are considering like betraying Starlight, but not really betraying Starlight, more so just them being fascinated by cutie marks and being fascinated by the main six, only for them to sort of rat out Starlight by like telling them about the cutie marks and how Starlight eventually decides to get rid of their cutie marks just for safekeeping. And obviously, in part two, once Starlight is exposed, there's this huge chase scene where Starlight is trying to run away with the main six's cutie marks. And while she is unable to hold on to them, like they eventually get their cutie marks back anyway. There's obviously that confrontation at the end where Starlight tries to blast Twilight, but then Twilight uses the shield spell, and Starlight's like, I studied for years and I never could figure that spell. And then Twilight tries to turn that into a friendship is magic moment. Starlight says that she should spare her all the friendship talk, and then she just runs away into the cave. Again, pretty nice way to wrap things up there and setting things up for the cutie remark, which obviously didn't quite pay off as much, but again, it's still good enough. Really, this is a pretty solid two-parter, and I feel like I enjoyed it more than The Return of Harmony. As time goes on, I feel like it just sticks to my mind more. And yes, while I do have that nitpick against it, it really isn't that big of an issue at the end of the day, which is a big reason why I do have it at least this high on the list. But again, I feel like it's not the best episode, and because of that, it is here number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and we actually have another two-parter to get into here. We have the episode that I had number 2 on my two-parter ranking, and it is still here. But here we have To Where and Back Again. And I do still like this episode a lot. It's interesting seeing how this is all the culmination of Starlight's redemption arc. And I do like how Starlight spends a lot of it really being nervous about the whole village and being reunited with them, with her going back to the village and feeling like she was going to be rejected, and her like using Trixie to go along with her to like offer some support, only for her to get there and for her to be accepted contrary to her expectations. But then that's still leading to her getting very anxious when she feels uncomfortable with them putting her back in a leadership position, so much so that she literally has a panic attack in that moment and tries blasting them away. And I did find that entire segment of the episode to be very interesting. She obviously gets back and notices that all of the ponies left in Ponyville are pretty off. And yeah, from that point on, it was kind of clear that they were obviously changelings pretending to be the rest of the main six. And I do like how that was sort of the reveal, how they didn't really imply much of the changelings plotting this invasion. It was only through them acting strange that Starlight starts to put the pieces together, with even Twilight, or I guess Twilight, claiming that Starlight should just forget about her issues, which was pretty interesting there. And then we see from here just Starlight getting Trixie and Discord and Thorax all together, all these misfits and all these people who were previously villainized, but them just working together to save the day. I did find that whole prospect pretty interesting, and it was a pretty entertaining episode from that point on. There's plenty of fun moments there, like with Discord, like thinking that he's found Fluttershy, only for all the changelings to put on this Fluttershy disguise, so he doesn't really know which one's which. You have Chrysalis's whole confrontation with Starlight towards the end, only for Starlight to push back and really be the one to save the day there. You have all the changelings being reformed as well, and them like changing their biology so that they no longer have to feed off love, but can be a bit less parasitic there. And in general, this is an all-around solid two-parter. But I feel like in comparison to the cutie map, I feel like it's still pretty better than that, but only slightly. I feel like they're both roughly around the same level at this point. And with me getting into some pretty great episodes at this point, I feel like this is about as high as I can put it, but it's still a very solid episode. And because of that, I do have it here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and we have 11 episodes left to cover in this part. And essentially, these final 11 episodes are the honorable mentions for the top 10, which is going to be in part 4. As all these episodes were in serious contention to be in the top 10, and actually some of them were even in the top 10 during previous versions of this list, but along the way were cut or jumbled around to where they're not in the top 10. I feel like all 11 of these episodes are very solid. They all have varying strengths to them that made them strong contenders to be in the top 10. But again, there were just some issues along the way that caused them to fall out of it. And essentially, how I'm going to be breaking this down is I'm going to be talking a lot about the merits of these episodes, but I'm also going to try to articulate why they didn't make the top 10 or things they could have done to be in the top 10 but aren't because they didn't. So at number 21, we have the first of these episodes, and funnily enough, this episode was in the top 10 despite its placement, but it just kept sliding down further and further until it's here. But here we have the Heartwarming Club, and I do like this episode a lot. It's very entertaining, it's very wholesome from beginning to end. Obviously, a lot of it is about Gallus and how he was the one to concoct this whole scheme, only for it to be revealed towards the end that he did. And he reveals that it's because he didn't have a family and that he felt like by getting everyone else in trouble that they could be stuck at the school with him, so he didn't have to be spending Heartwarming Eve alone. And there's also plenty of good world building stuff here as well, with where we get to see the different cultures like embark on their own holiday traditions, and that was all pretty good to see, especially when that was one of the main goals of the later seasons of the show. So again, a lot of great stuff. It has a reveal that isn't too obvious on first viewing, and does still have a satisfying payoff despite that. But the main reason that I did decide to leave it out of the top 10, and part of the reason why it slid down so much, is because I did feel like a lot of it did focus on world building. And yes, while it is a cool resolution for Gallus to essentially have this new family of his, I still felt like it kept sliding down, as I didn't feel like there was too much beyond that to really prop it up beyond that point. And it's for that reason that I did have it here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we have another episode that was actually on the list at one point, but again just kept sliding down. And here we have A Royal Problem. And I've always been a big defender of this episode. I feel like there's a lot of interesting stuff in here, like the way Starlight resorts to using magic to solve her problems when that was one of her big character flaws. You have Twilight getting really antsy whenever Starlight is dealing with the royals, as that's evidence in other things, like other episodes, showing how that's still a weak spot for her, how she always treats them very formally, and how she's always worried that even with her elevated status, that at any point they could just punish her or send someone to Tartarus or whatever. So I was fine with that. And then just seeing the sisters like interacting and just doing each other's thing is pretty interesting, especially with Luna and how she made such a big deal about how she cost the students their field trip because she didn't smile during the picture, which admittedly was a bit of an overreaction on her end and really just made it so that she was more guilty than she probably was. But still, I still like how they made a whole meal about that and how Luna just struggled so much to get over it, and how she very much struggled to like do stuff without thinking about it and just feeling guilty about it. So I do like that aspect of it. But the main reason why it's not on the list either is I feel like it's just a bit messy at points. I feel like I don't have as many issues with it, but I feel like there's enough messiness with it, like the fact that Starlight hasn't fully learned her lesson with using magic when she had already technically learned that lesson in every little thing she does. The fact that Twilight at this point should probably know better than to overreact, and just the overall negativity that parts of this episode have with the sisters getting into arguments. While it does have some funny moments, it's still not fun just seeing them getting into arguments like this, and also just seeing Twilight berating Starlight at every opportunity. So I felt like there were enough points that I didn't like in this episode to where I did slide it down to number 20 here. Now we're moving on to number 19, and these next 3 episodes were never really on the list to begin with, but they were more so episodes that just significantly went up in my estimation the more that I thought about them, to where they ended up here for whatever reason. But again, I just feel like they don't quite measure up to the top 10. And at number 19, we have one of these episodes, and here we have Scaremaster. And admittedly, this is definitely the episode on here that is the most influenced by my own bias, as I really do relate to the message here of Fluttershy not really resonating with Nightmare Night and not really wanting to partake in it. And despite her spending so much of the episode giving it a try and trying to make her friends happy and trying to make this a positive experience for them, that by the end, even after trying it and even after getting enough into the spirit to scare her friends, she still decides that it's not good enough for her and that she just has to accept the fact that she's not always going to have experiences to have with her friends. But that doesn't mean that she can't still have other experiences, even if they aren't related to her. And I know some people don't like the episode because of this message. They don't like how Fluttershy doesn't actually learn anything. But really, I still find this a very powerful message. And considering I don't like Halloween all that much, and I could care less about that, the fact that Fluttershy was willing to still back down, even after her attempts to partake simply just to make her friends happy, is very encouraging for me. And I do find that interesting that they were willing to go down that direction, as I feel like most other stories that are like this would end with Fluttershy scaring her friends and her finally seeing the joy in Nightmare Night. But for her to still know who she is deep down, the fact that she isn't willing to completely give up things that she likes and gives up what she wants to do in order to have a good time or just to do what she feels like others want her to do is still very empowering for me. But again, I do concede that a lot of that is my own personal bias, and I do recognize that people don't like the episode because of that. And honestly, I feel like when I think of the top 10 episodes, this one doesn't really scream out to me that much, as I feel like there are plenty of other episodes that do more outside that. And it's for that reason that I do have to leave it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and this is another episode that has jumped up the more that I thought about it, as it doesn't really stand out much on its own, but still has a lot of interesting stuff going on with it. And here we have Top Bolt, and I really love this episode as well, namely because of how it presents the relationship between Sky Stinger and Vapor Trail, as the two of them are essentially codependent on each other for a lot of it, where Sky Stinger is super confident, largely in part due to Vapor Trail giving him a bunch of wind gusts, while Vapor Trail is someone who doesn't really care much for the spotlight, but still gets to fulfill her dream because of how Sky Singer is presenting himself. And it's interesting seeing how much the two of them need each other, and also seeing Twilight and Rainbow Dash trying to help each other out, with Sky Singer needing to learn more of the technical stuff and him just trying to be a better flyer without Vapor Trail's help, while Vapor Trail is just getting more confidence, and the two of them realize that she's a much better flyer than she lets on, but is simply being overshadowed by Sky Singer because she's propping up Sky Singer throughout a lot of it. And obviously, there's that big scene later on where Vapor Trail finally lets it out to Sky Singer that he's not as good as he thinks he is, and he gets very upset at the situation where he basically accuses everyone of ganging up on him, of trying to make him look bad, which is obviously a very nice scene. And from there, we learned about their two backstories, with Sky Singer coming from a mostly crowded household with a lot of siblings and how he was always overshadowed. So he felt like he had to act out in order to get more attention, while Vapor Trail came from an only child household where her parents gave her all the attention in the world and it became too much for them. So it's through that the two of them became friends despite their differing personalities, to where they basically give each other what the other lacked, with Sky Singer getting all the attention that he so craved because he never got it as a child, and Vapor Trail getting to be more under the radar, as she always wanted to be more in the background after her parents gave her all the attention in the world. And it's interesting how the two of them are able to come together to basically both become more level individuals, but also able to both get into the Wonderbolts on their own. And I actually am a bit disappointed that these two never show up again after this episode, as I felt like it would have been interesting to see the two of them get a follow-up in a future episode, but that's just me. And it's also funny seeing the joke in the episode where Rainbow Dash gets summoned to go to the Wonderbolt Academy, like after she's been summoned for a break, and she's like, "Oh, but I was just there." And then at the end of the episode, after they resolve the conflict, she finally gets to go back home to relax, and then only for Spitfire to summon her back to the academy again, and she once again says, "But I was just there." I don't know, I found that very hilarious. So, really, this is a solid top tier episode, but really, compared to the top 10, I feel like it's still lacking something in that regard. And I think the fact that it didn't pop off to me more and doesn't have too much beyond that character dynamic, that I did decide to leave it out of here. And plus the fact that I never saw it as a top contender outside of that, but it is still a very, very solid episode. And because of that, it is here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17. And while this episode did stand out to me more than the last two episodes, I feel like it's another episode that did go up the more that I thought about it. And I know people have complaints about this episode, but I still feel like it's a genuinely strong episode. And here we have Flutter Brother, another season 6 episode. And this is another very solid episode. I mean, I know people don't like Zephyr Breeze, and honestly, he can get a bit annoying at points, which is one knock against the episode. But it's still interesting seeing his character arc throughout the episode, where he is basically a freeloader, and a lot of the episode is showing how he's increasingly getting out of doing hard work, like how he basically tricks other people into doing his jobs, like how he basically tricks Spike into doing all the cleaning for him by basically just asking him to demonstrate, and then he just sort of sat back and let Spike do it all by himself, which is pretty funny. He obviously tries to get the cat to do all of Rarity's work for him, but that completely backfires as well. And it's just really funny seeing Zephyr Breeze just trying all these different things only to give up right away. And that is his character arc in the episode, with him admitting that part of the reason why he's unable to complete a task is because he's afraid of failure, and how he's afraid of being put in a position where he is inferior and not breezing through something, and he just gives up at the first opportunity, which does lead into Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash helping him out by encouraging him to finish the hairstyle thing that he was basically going to school for until he dropped out, because the teachers there, they didn't like how he was a free spirit and how he didn't follow the instructions. And it is a pretty nice song with some very strong visuals. I always love that visual of Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy flying directly above him at the beginning of it, which is pretty amusing there. And it's just a pretty simple song, not a overly amazing song or super catchy, but it's still a very solid one that does fit right into Zephyr Breeze's character arc of him learning to not give up and just finish the task. And at the end of the day, it is a basic story for sure with a basic moral, but still one that is pretty interesting considering the type of character that Zephyr Breeze is, and how he is someone who has his very big ego and someone who puts on this big front, but deep down he is someone who can't really do anything on his own, and in general just struggles to push through adversity per se. Not to mention that this episode's pretty funny as well, where again I alluded to all the gags with Zephyr Breeze tricking people into doing the jobs he was assigned to do and just completely failing in that. But also other stuff like him thinking that Rainbow Dash has a crush on him. I always find those gags to be pretty funny as well, and just him being a freeloader and pretty annoying. But again, I feel like that's one of the knocks against this episode, is the fact that he's not the most likable character in the world. And yeah, while that is partially the point, it also makes this episode not as enjoyable as I feel like it could be. And I feel like compared to episodes we'll be talking about soon, I feel like the overall message, well, it's a pretty strong one. I feel like it's not as interesting as what we're going to be getting into soon, and I feel like it doesn't have the same amount of layers that those episodes do. And then because of that, I can't really have it any higher than 17 here. Now we're moving on to number 16, and these next two episodes were never in the top 10 at any point, mainly due to one issue that they have that I recognized from pretty early on and was enough to keep it out of this top tier here. However, these are still very solid episodes and ones that are among my favorites in this series. But number 16, we do have She's All Yak. And for me, the main thing holding me back from putting this episode higher is I feel like it doesn't go all the way with its premise. Something that I really give it a lot of credit for is that in addition to it being your standard be yourself story, that it has all this baggage of Yona feeling like yaks are inherently uncivilized, and that ponies are basically viewed at as the pinnacle of civilization, and that by taking part in a tradition that has historically been pony like, that she herself has to literally turn into a pony to not only participate in that tradition, but also to appeal to like Sandbar, who is himself a pony. And we see her going to Rarity and Pinky and Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash, trying to be more like a pony. And yes, while they don't really see the issue in Yona thinking that ponies are the only civilized group, they still like take it on because they assume that that's what Yona wants, and that they, despite their concerns, they went along with it because they felt like it was going to make Yona happy. Like Rarity makes Yona like look beautiful and make meet her definition of beauty because she felt like that was what Yona wanted. She made her like eat Brussels sprouts and trying to speak all articulate because Rarity herself comes from a background where she looks up to the high class and high society and feels like Yona would be also happy if by like embracing this that she'll feel like she's sophisticated as well. You have Pinky, who sees how disgusting Yona's like meal is that she has prepared and figures that she would be better off making cupcakes or something that's delicious, or at least delicious to the taste buds of ponies. And then you have Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash, who are literally teaching her how to dance by following the steps. So like we see all these instances of Yona trying to embrace pony culture, and that alone adds this interesting layer to this Be Yourself story that I felt like could have made it a top 10 episode. But my main issue is that I don't feel like it goes quite that far, or at least it doesn't go as far as I feel like it should. And granted, some of that's because they probably didn't want to completely like discuss all the racial issues that the previous seasons had, to where stuff like that requires a decent amount of subtext. But even so, I still feel like this is a very solid episode. It has a really great song with Fit Right In, which is a bit of a travesty that like G5 decided to have another song called Fit Right In that people now associate with that name, but that's for another video. And just in general, I do love this episode a lot, and I feel like it goes beyond your standard Be Yourself story. But again, I feel like the fact that it doesn't go deeper into this issue to where it could fully explore this whole concept is enough to have it fall here to number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and this episode's pretty similar to She's All Yak. And in fact, I feel like the issue that's holding me back with this episode is more blatant than She's All Yak, to where had this episode taken that approach versus what it actually did, that this episode probably would be in the top 10. But because it didn't, it's here. And here we have The Fault in Our Cutie Marks. And again, I feel like this is an amazing episode and one that was very, very close to making the top 10. But the main issue I have with this episode is the ending, where it turns out that Gabby decided to fake her cutie mark, not because she was deeply upset about not being able to get one, how the CMC aren't able to help her, and that she just can't accept the fact that Griffins can't get cutie marks. But she says that while she was a little upset, she really wanted to make the CMC feel better about themselves after feeling like they were failures. And for me, that was a bit of a cop out. I felt like it was so clear how upset Gabby was when the CMC that they didn't know how to help her get her cutie mark, that I felt like her faking a cutie mark in order to make herself feel better about not being able to get a cutie mark would have been so much better for this episode, in my opinion. And with her being confronted by the fact that she is unable to have her cutie mark, I feel like her behavior from that point on in the episode was so consistent with that storyline. And we even see the CMC speculate about this and feel like that was the reason she was trying to show off her cutie mark and then run away before they could examine deeper. But again, they just backed out at the last moment and went for this more subversive approach. And it's not as if the subversive approach is bad. I mean, I get why Gabby would want to make the CMC feel better, but I felt like it would have been so much better if Gabby herself was still in denial and the ending was more so about us seeing the process of Gabby accept the fact that she can't get a cutie mark, but even so, she can like take on the spirit of a cutie mark by giving herself a life's purpose. I feel like if we had seen that acceptance happen on screen, that it would have been a top 10 episode for me. As if we're taking that out, this is an amazing episode. I mean, the whole premise of someone like a Gabby coming along, approaching the CMC about wanting to get her cutie mark, only for her to be incapable of doing so. And in doing so, also challenging the CMC to try and find a way around this, all while they were trying to tell themselves that maybe there is a way Griffin could get a cutie mark. But then, as they just see her trying everything, only for none of those things to get a cutie mark, that they just come to terms with that reality. And of course, not to mention all the subtext there with Scootaloo trying to defend all this by saying that maybe it'll be like her trying to fly, where it seems impossible, but maybe if we try hard enough, it could be possible. Again, the fact that that was even an element in the episode is pretty good, in my opinion. And of course, the song is also pretty catchy as well. So, really, this episode had a lot of makings for a top 10 episode, but it's just that decision at the end to back out of what should have been a pretty good resolution that was just served up to them on a platter. And for them to have that resolution of Gabby accepting her inability to get a cutie mark, for that to take place off screen, and for us to not even see that is a bit of a letdown for me. And for me, that was enough to keep this episode outside the top 10. But if we're taking that out, this is still a great episode. And because of that, it is here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14. And this episode was also never really in the top 10 at any point. But it is an episode that has jumped up quite a bit since the last time that I talked about it, which is a bit strange because I do love this episode. But after thinking about some more, I think it's even better than what I gave it credit for before. And we actually have the highest ranked season 1 episode left to talk about. And here we have Party of One. And my main issue with this episode before was the fact that Pinky forgot her own birthday. And that was obviously an issue that I had with the episode for the longest time. But after reevaluating it some more, I actually no longer think that's that big of an issue. As when you really think about it, a lot of this episode is focusing on how Pinky is always caring for others and is always interested in throwing parties for others. Where even in the episode where she is like losing her mind and thinking that her friends have ditched her, despite the fact that it was her birthday, she wasn't upset that she was throwing a party for herself and the others were simply ignoring her, maybe because they were just playing their own party for her. It was because she was throwing a party for Gummy, and an after birthday party, in fact. So it was just further going out of its way to show how Pinky is so focused on throwing parties for others, of being there for others, that she kind of can forget about herself at points. And I feel like with that interpretation, the episode does become a bit more interesting to me. As even if we're taking it out, this is still a fantastic episode that has a very good mix of both drama and comedy, with the comedy coming from the ways in which Pinky's trying to get some answers out of her friends, only for them to not give her any. Like the fact that she goes to Applejack, and Applejack is just having to lie about how there's nothing going on in the barn. And the fact that they're exchanging all these funny faces while Pinky's becoming more suspicious is pretty hilarious to me. There's also the after birthday party scene itself, where Pinky has turned to Pink and Mina, and she's literally like pretending that she is having all these friends over, and she's like role playing all these friends when they're all inanimate objects, and just losing her mind that way. That's also pretty funny. And just in general, like the interrogation scene when Spike is just completely oblivious to what's going on. He fails to see just how seriously Pinky is taking this, and it's just trying to get out of the conflict at every opportunity and to get the gems. And literally, like, he says exactly what Pinky wants him to say by saying how her friends are ignoring her because they don't like her parties and they don't want to be her friends anymore. And then when Pinky just admits that this is a good thing because it's confirming what she already believed, only to lose all hope afterwards, like, Spike just completely ignores her and just goes straight for the gems, which I do find pretty funny, but also pretty sad. But really, the center of this episode is about Pinky and her just increasingly giving in to her insecurities, that the moment her friends are not spending time with her and are literally coming up with all these really terrible lies in order to like not be around her, like she very quickly comes to the conclusion that they just don't want to be her friends anymore. And when you add that in with that little moment right after Gummy's birthday party, when Twilight's leaving and she's trying to get her to stay by saying, "Oh, there's some cake left," you can see the sadness inherent in Pinky and just how terrified she is at being alone and how she's willing to go to these great lengths to avoid being alone and how she's demanding of answers when like her friends aren't giving her the time of day and it's very obvious that they're going out of their way to not spend time with her. It's not as if Pinky is just naturally going into the state because she's not surrounded by others. It's the fact that her friends are coming up with all these lies to like go off and like prepare the surprise birthday party for her, while Pinky is just feeling like it's her friends actively ignoring her, and she is obviously led to come to these conclusions about why they're not spending time with her and coming up with blatant lies to not spend time with her. So I feel like this episode is definitely more perfect upon re-examination than I give it credit for, even at the time of the season 1 episode ranking. But I feel like compared to the top 10, I feel like it doesn't quite go all the way in that direction. Like even like the stuff where Pinky is like demanding that Spike say that her friends don't want to be friends with her anymore. Like I felt like that was one of the few moments where that insecurity was really brought to light. And I feel like had this episode had a couple more moments like that, that it could have really propelled this episode forward. But I feel like as it is, it's just a very solid episode with the very minor flaw of Pinky forgetting her own birthday and the fact that she doesn't come to that conclusion. But even then, I felt like I was able to cover that up pretty well. And it's for that reason that I have it here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and sort of similar to Party of One, we are actually wrapping up another season here, believe it or not. But unlike Party of One, this episode was at least in the top 10 at one point, and it was only later that I took it off. But here we have The Perfect Pair, which is the highest ranked season 7 episode left to talk about. And this is obviously another great episode, very solid episode, and one that really does a great job at summarizing the story of Applejack's parents and showing how they fell in love and how it became about these star-crossed lovers and how we literally see Applejack's mother disowning her family in order to be with her father. And I also love the presentation as well, where we see each of the Apple siblings like getting pieces of the story by going to these different people like Mrs. Cake and Mayor and eventually Grandpa Pear as well. So I find that aspect of it to be pretty interesting, not to mention the song, which is pretty strong. And then we also have the ending where we see like the tree that was that they planted years ago to show their love, of showing how these two families have intertwined and crossed together and wrapped each other around each other, embracing each other to create this grand thing that's bigger than the sum of their parts. So this is still a very solid episode, and I get why people consider this one of the best episodes of the series. But honestly, the reason I bumped it off the top 10 is simply due to personal preference, because while this is an amazing episode, I feel like I have a better personal connection to the remaining episodes left to talk about. And plus, I feel like some of the things that people prop it up for, like the presentation and the song, are all things that are pretty good. But I still feel like the core of the episode is relatively simple. Like the actual story of them being star-crossed lovers isn't the most unique in the world. And plus, I feel like it doesn't really give me as much to grasp onto. But still, that doesn't take away from how amazing this episode is. And it's for that reason that I have it here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12. And I also seriously considered putting this episode on the list. However, after thinking about it, I did decide that the other episodes were simply more interesting than it. But here we have The Last Laugh from season 9. And this is another very, very strong episode. I like the concept of Cheese Sandwich creating this factory in order to mass produce his gags and to maximize the amount of happiness and laughter, but in doing so, he ends up depriving himself of his spark and him just being pretty miserable throughout a lot of it. I like that dichotomy between Stan Smirks and Cheese Sandwich, where you can very clearly tell that Stan Smirks is much better suited to run a factory and to mass produce like laughter and to treat it like a science than someone like a Cheese Sandwich who has to be out in the field in order to do so. And I particularly appreciate how Stan Smirks is never actually a villain at any point, despite him seeming like he could have been one. Like I could have seen like Cheese Sandwich trying to back out of the factory only for Stan Smirks to point to their profit margins and how like he can't leave the factory because he's the president or whatever. But really, we see Stan Smirk just be a complete ally to Cheese Sandwich the whole time, always looking up to him as the more comedic figure, always looking up to him as a source of inspiration. And even towards the end, when Cheese Sandwich comes to his senses, he regains his laughter and chooses to leave the factory. Stan Smirk is by his side and he's happy to accept his role as the new owner of the factory. So I like that dichotomy. I like the chemistry between Pinky and Cheese and how Pinky herself has come to Cheese in order to help find her purpose. And the whole concept of Pinky feeling like she needs to find her own purpose once she sees her other friends like going on to bigger and better things, like Rarity like building a franchise, and Rainbow Dash becoming a Wonderbolt, and Twilight becoming the ruler of Equestria, and Fluttershy like owning a sanctuary, and Applejack owning the apple farm. Like she feels like she's in the same spot, and she also needs to have this big transformation, only for her to learn at the end that she's fine the way she is, and she kind of self-actualizes in that regard as well. And obviously, with the foreshadowing that Cheese and Pinky would eventually become a romantic couple is another interesting aspect to all this. The song is also very strong. There's a lot of good humor here as well, like a lot of gags and all of the stuff that Pinky tries out in order to help Cheese Sandwich try to regain his laughter. I like how at the end we literally have Pinky like recounting the story and how she included the part where she decided to go back and tell them about the story, sort of breaking the fourth wall that way. There's a lot of fantastic stuff in this episode that made me seriously consider putting it in the top 10. And it's really just due to the competition of these top 10 that I did decide to leave it out. But it's still a very solid episode and one of my favorites of the series. And because of that, I do have it here at number 12. And finally, the final episode we'll be covering in this part at number 11. This episode was literally on the list before I hit record, but then I did some last minute shuffling and I did decide to leave it out. But this is still a great episode. But here at number 11, we have from season 2, Hurricane Fluttershy. And I was very, very close to putting this one on the list, as a lot of people love this episode, and I love it as well. I love seeing Fluttershy's character grow throughout this episode, how a lot of it is tied to her having stage fright and how she feels like others will bully her or judge her like for taking part in the ritual, and her like trying so hard to improve her speed only for her to be unable to do so. And we see people like Spike pointing this out. We see like when she like does the test that the others chuckle at her the moment she gains any semblance of confidence, that causes her to back off and obviously lose enough speed to where Spike points out, isn't that less than one? Which obviously makes Fluttershy very anxious. There's that whole visual of all the eyes staring at her, which causes her to run off crying. And they ask her if she's really going to give up like this. And then with tears flowing down her face, she says, yes. There's the whole scene afterwards of the animals comforting Fluttershy, and that she gets motivated to try again to become stronger. But even so, like she doesn't improve the speed enough to where she feels good enough to participate. And a lot of the episode is focusing on her trying to build the confidence to like participate. And even when she tries, she still gives up at certain points. And it's really coming down to her at the end of the day, to where it's ultimately coming down to her like deciding to fly, because she at first determines that she's not going to be enough, but then they tell her that every little bit counts, and she does fly up. And despite her not being the strongest flyer in the world, it's just enough to allow all the water to go up to the clouds, and she's able to be the hero at the end. So this is still a very inspirational story. It's one that's very central to Fluttershy's character development, and it's in general a very wholesome episode. But again, we are now at the point now where I do have to factor in just how much these episodes have to offer. How much enjoyment do I get out of these episodes? And how much intrigue is there going on in these episodes? And Hurricane Fluttershy offers a ton of that. It's clearly does so, as it's number 11 on this list. But after thinking about it some more, I figured that it just missed the cut here, and it is here at number 11. And with that, we have now wrapped up part 3 of this 4-part series, and we have done it. We have gone through most of the list at this point, and we now just have the top 10 left to talk about. And as I said before, I am planning to make the top 10 its own video. I figured that these episodes are all strong enough to where they deserve having their own video dedicated to them. And just in general, I want to thank you all again for joining me on this experience. And I know that these videos have been very, very long, but it's just been fun just going through all these episodes and ranking them. And believe me when I say that the latter part of this particular part was chaotic. I cannot tell you how much rearranging I did, how much reshuffling that I did, how much episodes moved around in order to get to the eventual places that they ended up doing. Like, I cannot believe how time consuming and how much thought really I had to put in order to figure out where these episodes would land. And even now, I know that some people may end up disagreeing with some of my takes here, but again, as I've stressed before, this list is my opinion and how I feel about these episodes. And admittedly, I know that in this part, I talked about episodes that plenty of people would have in their top 10s, things like The Perfect Pair and things like A Lot Wedding, all these episodes that are widely beloved and probably would be in the top 10 of other people if they were to make a list like this. But again, this is just my opinion. And while I do love a lot of these episodes, and while I spent pretty much the last couple of hours praising all these episodes, all while knocking them down to various degrees, I still do love the vast majority of episodes from this series. And it was just very, very difficult to narrow it down and make the cuts that I needed to make. But I am now very excited to announce that we are inside the top 10 and that we are almost there. We are almost done with this ranking. And I once again have to thank you all for being a part of this experience. And I'm happy to join you all in part 4 when we finally go through the top 10 best episodes of Friendship is Magic. But there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. And again, the next video is simply going to be the top 10 best episodes of Friendship is Magic, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. But for now, that's the video. See ya.